Before the first dawn ever broke, before the stars learned how to burn, there was nothing. No earth, no sky, not even darkness as we understand it. There was only chaos, not chaos as confusion or disorder, but chaos as the Greeks imagined it, a vast yawning gulf, an emptiness pregnant with every possibility. Within that silence slept everything that would one day become, the seed of time, the taste of light, the pulse of life waiting for the command to begin. From this deep stillness came Gaia, the earth. She was not merely soil or stone, she was the great living foundation, the heartbeat of existence itself. Her body became the mountains, her veins the rivers, her breath the wind. She was followed by Tartarus, the hidden abyss, the mirror of chaos below creation, and then by Eros, the first gentle motion of desire, the force that drives all things to join, to reproduce, to reach beyond themselves. When love entered the void, the universe stirred awake. Gaia gave birth to Uranus, the sky, a great vault of blue that arched above her. Together they became the first divine couple, the earliest union of heaven and earth, and from that union came the first generation of mighty beings, the Titans, 12 colossal powers, each embodying some aspect of the cosmos. Oceanus, the endless sea that circled the world, Hyperion, the light that blazes from the sun, Theia, the glow of sight and radiance, Coeus and Phoebe, the twin poles of intellect and prophecy, and many more. Their world was raw and new, without humans, cities, or language, only the deep hum of creation finding its rhythm. But perfection never lasts. Uranus, fearing his own children, looked down from his high crystal throne and saw strength rising from the earth. These were not frail, passing lives. They were immortal, vast, restless. In fear, he forced them back into Gaia's womb, burying them deep within her body. The earth groaned and trembled in torment. Out of her pain came anger, and out of anger came rebellion. Gaia carved from her own mountains a sickle made of flint, a blade sharp enough to cut the sky itself. She called her children to arms, but only the youngest, Cronus, dared to obey. As night fell, Uranus descended to lie upon Gaia. Then from the darkness, Cronus struck. The heavens screamed. With one blow, the old order was broken, and the sky and earth were torn apart forever. From the drops of Uranus's blood that fell upon the sea rose strange beings, the Furies, spirits of vengeance, the giants, born of pain, and from the white foam of the waves, Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, proof that even violence can create wonder. Cronus seized the throne of creation. Under his rule, the world entered what poets later called the Golden Age. In those days, the earth gave its fruits freely, rivers ran with honey, and no man knew hunger or death. The Titans ruled not through cruelty, but through natural law. Time itself, embodied by Cronus, flowed evenly and without decay. Yet even golden ages bear the whisper of their end. For the same prophecy that had doomed Uranus now haunted his son. One day, a child of Cronus would overthrow him. Fear makes tyrants of all rulers, and Cronus became a devourer. Each time his queen, Rhea, bore a child, he swallowed the newborn whole, believing that by consuming his offspring, he could consume fate itself. The first 5 children, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, vanished into the darkness of his belly. But when the 6th child was born, Rhea could endure no more. She fled to the island of Crete, where beneath the echoing cave of Mount Ida she gave birth to Zeus, the last hope of heaven and earth. In the stillness of that cave, attended by nymphs and spirits of the mountain, the infant god was hidden. To protect him, Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth and gave it to Cronus. The deceived Titan swallowed the stone, never realizing that destiny had already slipped through his fingers. Zeus grew in secret, nursed by the goat Amalthea and guarded by the Curetes, warriors who clashed their shields and swords so that Cronus would not hear the child's cries. There, beneath dripping stalactites in eternal darkness, the young god learned the silence of patience and the language of thunder. When he reached manhood, Zeus returned to confront the father who had consumed the world. With the help of Metis, the goddess of wisdom and craft, he tricked Cronus into drinking a draught that made him vomit up the children he had swallowed. One by one, they returned to the light, Hestia first, then Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, reborn and furious. Together they formed a new alliance against the old. The war that followed, the Titanomachy, shook existence itself. For 10 years the sky burned with lightning, and the seas boiled with rage. Mountains shattered as the sons of earth hurled whole ranges against the heavens. The Titans, towering and ancient, fought from the peaks of Othrys. The younger gods, swift and shining, fought from Mount Olympus. The very air turned to fire, and even the stars fled. But Zeus had cunning as well as courage. From the depths of Tartarus he freed the Cyclopes, the one-eyed smiths of the forge, and the Hecatonchires, the hundred-handed giants, who had been imprisoned by Uranus in the earliest age. In gratitude, the Cyclopes forged 3 weapons that would define the next era. For Zeus, the thunderbolt; for Poseidon, the trident; and for Hades, the helm of invisibility. With these divine tools, the tide of battle turned. The Titans were defeated, their chains clattering into the abyss. Cronus himself was cast down, and the world shuddered into a new order. After the smoke cleared, the 3 brothers drew lots for dominion over creation. Zeus claimed the sky, where storms dance and lightning speaks. Poseidon took the sea, the restless mirror of the heavens. Hades accepted the underworld, the hidden kingdom beneath all things. The earth? Their mother's body they agreed to share. And so the realms were divided, heaven, ocean, and shadow. For the first time, power was balanced by law. But law, as mortals and gods alike would learn, is never pure. Within every decree lies the seed of rebellion. Zeus ruled as king, but even kings must bow to prophecy and oath. He was the god of order, yet his reign would be haunted by temptation and fear. Hera, his queen, presided beside him with dignity and jealousy in equal measure. Poseidon's storms shook the continents when mortals broke their vows. Hades, quiet and severe, kept to his realm, claiming no power on earth, yet holding dominion over every soul that ever lived. Around them the new gods took their places. Athena, born from Zeus's mind; Apollo, radiant with truth; Artemis, keeper of the wild; Aphrodite, desire incarnate; Hermes, the herald of change. Olympus filled with voices, songs, quarrels, and oaths. The universe had at last found its order, but order, by its nature, invites disobedience. For even as Olympus celebrated its triumph, another prophecy arose. It warned that a child born to the sea goddess Thetis would become stronger than his father. Fearful of repeating the fate of Uranus and Cronus, Zeus acted swiftly. He denied himself her love and gave her instead to a mortal, Peleus of Thessaly. Their wedding, blessed by all the gods, would one day give birth to Achilles, the greatest warrior of the age of men, and the first shadow of Troy. Thus the pattern of fear and prophecy, of love sacrificed for power, began anew. Zeus's victory did not erase the memory of his father's fall. It merely hid it beneath thunder. He ruled with justice, but his justice was absolute. Mortals would learn to fear the sky not only for its storms, but for the gaze that watched from above. Yet it was under Zeus's reign that the universe became structured. The seasons turned, the stars took their stations, and time, once a devourer, became a rhythm by which the living could count their days. Still, the story of creation was not complete. The world was vast but empty of thought. Trees grew, rivers flowed, beasts wandered, yet there was no one to remember, no mind to tell the story of what had been. The gods had carved their empires, but they lacked an audience. And so the final act of creation awaited, a being fragile enough to die and yet daring enough to question the divine. That being would be human, and the spark of their birth would come not from heaven's will, but from an act of theft. Deep in the caverns of Olympus, a Titan who had survived the war watched this new order with pity. His name was Prometheus, the forethinker, and his gift would soon ignite a flame the gods could not contain. But that is another story, a story of fire, rebellion, and hope that refused to die. Thus ended the age before Olympus. The world had shape and power had found its masters. Sky and sea and underworld each stood in balance, bound by the thunder of Zeus and the silence of fate. Yet in the ashes of the Titans' defeat, the seeds of the next age had already begun to grow. Creation had moved from chaos to order, from silence to song, but the song was unfinished. It awaited a voice that could speak not as a god, but as a man. And so the torch was passed, unseen, from the divine to the mortal, from the fires of rebellion to the flicker of understanding. The cosmos waited for a hand that would steal the flame and call it knowledge. When the last echoes of the Titanomachy faded into the distant hollows of the world, the new rulers of creation ascended the slopes of Mount Olympus. The mountain did not resemble anything found in the mortal world. It rose from the earth like a column of white stone piercing a mantle of clouds, its summit hidden in perpetual radiance. Those who gazed upon it from afar saw only a peak shrouded in shimmering mist, but to those with immortal eyes, Olympus was a vast city of light, suspended between the realms of nature and eternity. It was here that the victors of the Great War established their home, and it was from here that they would shape the destiny of the cosmos. Zeus, the newly crowned king, understood that conquest alone could not secure his rule. He had witnessed the downfall of his father, Cronus, and the downfall of his father before him. Power seized by force could only be maintained by careful balance. He sought not merely to dominate the universe, but to govern it. In this he differed from the Titans, who had ruled by instinct and fear. Zeus knew that to hold the throne he must build a structure of order that no rebellion could easily topple. So he set about forming a court, a council of gods whose power would stabilize the world rather than threaten it. The great hall of Olympus, carved from the mountain's own luminous stone, became the center of this new order. It was a place where the air hummed with divine energy and the pillars glowed with an inner fire, as though the mountain's heart pulsed through its veins. At its center stood Zeus's throne, high-backed and adorned with eagles, lightning bolts, and symbols of justice. Here he would preside over councils, disputes, and ceremonies. Around him gathered the gods who would form the foundation of myth, law, and civilization. Poseidon, tall and broad-shouldered, carried the scent of the sea wherever he walked. His hair moved like waves in a storm. His eyes shone like deep waters. Though he had accepted the lot that assigned him the sea, he resented being placed second to Zeus. His palace beneath the ocean was a marvel beyond description, with walls made of coral and ceilings formed from drifting schools of glowing fish. But Olympus was where decisions were made, and Poseidon understood that being absent from the throne room meant giving Zeus more power. So he took his seat at the council, carrying with him the rumble of distant tides. Hades, the eldest of the brothers, walked silently into the hall. He did not step lightly, nor did he make his presence insignificant. Rather, he moved with the quiet authority of one who understood permanence. He did not wear a crown, for the underworld required no display of grandeur. His realm was deeper and more eternal than Olympus, and his power lay not in thunder or oceans, but in the simple truth that all living things eventually returned to him. Mortals feared him, but his siblings respected him. They knew that without Hades there could be no stability, no end to cycles, no structure to existence. He sat at the council not to seek dominion but to maintain balance. Around them gathered the other immortals. Hera, Zeus's queen and sister, carried herself with a regal beauty that concealed her inner turmoil. She wished for loyalty, for dignity, for a marriage unbroken by betrayal. But her husband's wanderings across the world, his affairs with nymphs, goddesses, and mortal women, wounded her deeply. Her presence in the council chamber was both commanding and cold. She embodied order, family, and the holy bonds of marriage, bonds her own husband frequently violated. Zeus knew her power and respected her intelligence, yet he feared her wrath. Hera's decisions were rarely made from impulse. She waited, watched, and struck with precision. Athena took her place next. Born not through natural birth, but through an eruption of divine force, she embodied intellect and discipline. Her armor gleamed like silver dawn, and her eyes reflected the clarity of reason. Among the gods, she alone was entirely without childhood. Wisdom poured through her as naturally as breath. Mortals would one day look to her for guidance in matters of strategy, statecraft, and philosophy. She stood beside Zeus not merely as his daughter, but as his counselor, offering him insight that shaped the principles by which Olympus governed the world. Apollo, radiant as the sun, moved across the hall with a grace matched only by the sound of his golden lyre. He represented harmony, the harmony found in music, in prophecy, in the movement of the heavens. Mortals would soon learn to see him as the god who bridged the divine and the human mind, revealing truth through dreams, songs, and sacred visions. His twin sister Artemis followed him. She was the moon to his sun, the wilderness to his order. Wrapped in the cool glow of lunar light, she walked with the confidence of one who answered to no man, mortal or divine. Her bow, carved from silver branches, was a symbol of her independence. Aphrodite, born from the foam of the sea's most ancient wound, entered with a kind of beauty that made even gods fall silent. Her presence softened the air, her footsteps seemed to leave behind a fragrance no mortal flower could produce. Yet beneath her delicate exterior lay a power greater than many understood. Desire could move armies, change outcomes of wars, alter the course of kingdoms. She embodied not lust alone, but the human longing for connection, admiration, and belonging, the very forces that shape civilization. Ares, her lover and the god of war, arrived with a clang of armor. He radiated heat, restlessness, and the savagery of battle. Unlike Athena's strategic mind, Ares represented the chaos of conflict, the rage that drives men to violence, the madness that overtakes soldiers in the heat of war. Few among the gods trusted him, yet even they recognized that war, like storms and seasons, was part of life. Ares carried passion, destruction, and the unpredictable side of human nature. Hermes darted in after him, swift and light-footed, his winged sandals whispering across the marble floor. He greeted each god with a mischievous smile and a clever remark. As messenger, trickster, merchant, and diplomat, he balanced truth and lies with equal ease. His presence reminded the council that communication, words, signals, negotiations, were as vital to governance as strength and wisdom. Hephaestus arrived last. He limped slightly, the result of injuries sustained in infancy, but he walked tall with dignity. His hands bore the marks of flame and metalwork, and his beard smelled faintly of smoke from the forge. He was the creator of wonders, weapons for gods, jewelry for goddesses, and machines for mortals. His craftsmanship shaped culture and technology, the early seeds of civilization. These gods and goddesses, each with their own virtues and flaws, formed the first divine polity, a kind of supernatural city-state mirroring the societies that would one day worship them. Their relationships were complex, their alliances unstable, their quarrels monumental. But together they created a model of power that influenced the political imagination of Europe for centuries. The laws of Olympus emerged gradually, shaped by argument, necessity, and the echoes of the Titanomachy. The first and most sacred of these laws was the sanctity of oaths. To speak an oath unwisely was to endanger the cosmos itself. If a god swore by the river Styx, the boundary of life and death, that oath became binding even upon Zeus. Such a promise could not be broken without devastating consequences. This belief extended into Greek society, and through them into European legal tradition. One sees its echo in feudal contracts, in medieval marriage vows, and parliamentary oaths that remain to this day. The second law was the separation of domains. Each god ruled a specific part of existence, and to encroach upon another's territory was to invite conflict. The sea belonged to Poseidon, the sky to Zeus, the earth to all, yet governed indirectly through their influence. Wisdom belonged to Athena, war to Ares and Athena together, love to Aphrodite, trade to Hermes, harvest to Demeter, the hearth to Hestia, craftsmanship to Hephaestus. This distribution prevented the concentration of power that had doomed the Titans. It was, in essence, the first cosmic system of checks and balances. The third law concerned punishment for arrogance. Mortals who boasted beyond their capacity or challenged gods were swiftly corrected. The stories of Niobe, Arachne, and Tantalus illustrate this cosmic intolerance for hubris. Even gods were not immune. When Apollo and Poseidon attempted to overthrow Zeus, they were punished with humiliating labor. When Hera conspired against her husband, she was imprisoned in golden chains until she repented. This theme became central to Greek tragedy, and through them the moral framework of European literature. Pride precedes downfall. The fourth law was the supremacy of fate. Even Zeus, king of gods, acknowledged forces beyond his reach. The Moirai, the Fates, controlled the thread of life for every mortal and immortal. Clotho spun the thread, Lachesis measured it, and Atropos cut it. Their decisions were absolute. Not even the king of Olympus could defy them. This idea shaped the European worldview for centuries, appearing in medieval concepts of divine providence, Shakespearean tragedy, and modern discussions of destiny. As the laws took shape, the world below also transformed. Seas calmed, land settled, weather patterns stabilized. The planet, once raw and chaotic, became habitable. Animals populated forests, valleys, and plains. Rivers carved their paths with predictable obedience to gravity. Mountains rose as boundaries between realms. In this newly ordered world, the gods saw potential for something more, a creature capable of thought, imagination, worship, and ambition. Zeus recognized that without beings to remember and honor them, the gods' victory over the Titans would eventually fade into obscurity. The world needed witnesses, it needed storytellers, it needed a species that would marvel at the stars, question the heavens, and strive to build societies reflecting the divine order. But before Zeus could act, another figure took the stage. Not a god of Olympus, but a Titan who had survived the war. Prometheus. He watched the new order unfold with calculating eyes. Where Zeus saw subjects, Prometheus saw partners. He believed the world was incomplete without intelligent beings to inhabit it. So he stole clay from the riverbanks, shaped figures in his own likeness, and breathed life into them with the help of Athena. These new beings, humans, were fragile, curious, and utterly unprepared for the dangers of existence. But they possessed something no other creature had: awareness. Humans feared the cold, the dark, the wild beasts that encircled their primitive shelters. They had no claws for protection, no thick fur for warmth, no wings to escape danger. Prometheus understood their limitations and sought to give them an advantage. So he stole fire from the chariot of the sun and carried it to earth concealed in a hollow fennel stalk. Fire changed everything. It gave humans the ability to cook, to forge tools, to harden weapons, to create pottery, and to shape metals. It provided warmth in the cold, light in the night, and safety against predators. But more importantly, fire gave humans imagination. Flames flickered like thoughts, crackled like ideas, and transformed raw materials into art and utility. Fire was not merely a gift, it was a revolution. It allowed humans to aspire to the divine. Zeus did not welcome this rebellion. Fire had been a privilege of gods. By giving it to mortals, Prometheus blurred the boundaries between divine and human. Enraged, Zeus devised a punishment unlike any other. Prometheus was chained to a cliff in the Caucasus Mountains, where each day an eagle descended to tear out his liver. Because he was immortal, the organ regenerated each night, making his agony eternal. Such was the price of kindness in a world governed by hierarchy. But Zeus's retribution did not stop with the Titan. He believed humans needed a reminder of their place. So he ordered Hephaestus to craft a woman whose beauty would conceal danger, Pandora. Her arrival among men brought curiosity, desire, and a sealed jar containing all manner of suffering, sickness, famine, despair. When she opened the jar, all these miseries escaped into the world. Only hope remained trapped inside. The gods had punished humanity for the theft of fire, and through this punishment they introduced the complexities that define human existence. From Olympus, the gods watched as mankind struggled, yet they were not indifferent. They intervened, sometimes to help, sometimes to harm, often driven by personal motives rather than cosmic justice. Zeus might send rain to bless a village one day, and a lightning bolt to destroy a palace the next. Poseidon might calm the sea for a fisherman and drown an arrogant king. Athena might inspire a hero with wisdom, while Aphrodite might destroy a family through unrestrained passion. The gods of Olympus became intertwined with human civilization. The Greeks built temples in their honor, carved statues to represent their forms, and wrote myths to explain their actions. These stories became the foundation of Western culture. They shaped European art, literature, law, and philosophy. They provided a language for understanding human nature, its strengths, weaknesses, desires, and fears. Olympus itself became a reflection of human society, with its feasts, quarrels, romances, rivalries, and alliances. The gods were immortal, but they were not perfect. They loved, hated, envied, forgave, and made mistakes. Their stories offered lessons not through divine perfection, but through divine imperfection, showing Europe that greatness and flaw often exist side by side. Thus the new order solidified, not through unbroken peace, but through an ever-shifting balance of power. The gods had won the war against the Titans, but they had inherited a complex, living universe filled with emotion and unpredictability. Olympus became the center of this universe, a brilliant but volatile capital from which the gods ruled their realms and shaped the destiny of the world. And far below, humans, armed with fire, memory, and hope, began to write their own stories that would one day elevate them from creatures of clay to builders of cities, tellers of epics, and creators of culture. The foundation of myth was laid, and with it began the age of heroes, an age in which men and gods would walk the same world, each shaping the other in ways neither could yet imagine. The world after Prometheus's punishment was no longer the quiet, flawless landscape that had existed at the dawn of creation. It had become heavier, more complex, burdened with the new presence of humankind. They wandered the forests and valleys of the earth, fragile but determined, their hands warmed by the stolen fire and their minds filled with dreams they could not yet describe. Fire brought them light, but it also brought awareness, a double-edged gift that illuminated both possibility and suffering. As the gods watched from Olympus, the mortal world entered an age unlike any that had come before, an age shaped by struggle, curiosity, and the restless hunger to rise beyond mere survival. Humans learned quickly. They learned to harden metal in flames, to carve stone with increasing precision, to store grain for the winter months. Villages formed near rivers and coastlines where fertile soil promised bread and fish-filled waters promised life. The invention of pottery allowed them to carry water. The invention of shelters allowed them to endure storms. Every advancement made the gods pause with a mixture of admiration and worry. Mortals were weak, but they were persistent. They stumbled often, but each generation stood a little taller than the one before. Some gods took an interest in this new species. Athena visited mortals in dreams, guiding their hands as they wove cloth or carved marble. She admired their potential to build civilizations rooted in knowledge and discipline. Demeter taught them the secrets of agriculture, showing them how seeds should be sown, when the soil should be turned, and how seasons followed patterns written into the earth. Under her influence, humans came to understand the cycles of life and death, of growth and rest. They learned to plant wheat in autumn, harvest in spring, and store grain against famine. For the first time, human survival depended on planning rather than chance. But not all gods were benevolent. Ares wandered the world with a restless hunger. He whispered to mortal kings about the glory of victory and the intoxicating thrill of conquest. Conflict followed him everywhere like a shadow. Clans that once lived peacefully began to form rivalries. Spears were sharpened, shields carved, and blood spilled. The gods of Olympus had not intended for mankind to mirror their own quarrels, but the reflections were unavoidable. Mortals became entangled in the passions of the immortals, and each divine influence produced new wonders and new disasters. Meanwhile, Zeus observed humanity with a cautious eye. He respected their growth, yet he feared it. Prometheus had proven that even the smallest spark of defiance could reshape the universe. Zeus did not want another rebellion. So he allowed mortals just enough wisdom to survive, but not enough to threaten Olympus. When human pride rose too high, he sent storms or plagues to remind them of their place. Yet even Zeus, for all his vigilance, could not control the curiosity that grew in mortal hearts. For the first time in the history of the world, creation had given rise to creatures who questioned not only the world around them, but the gods who ruled above them. In the early years of mankind, tribes lived separately, scattered across the vast, unclaimed landscapes of Greece. They fished, hunted, farmed, and built crude temples from stone and timber. They offered sacrifices to the sky, hoping Zeus would grant them rain, and to the sea, praying Poseidon would calm the waves. They carried small idols of Athena or Aphrodite, carved from bone or clay. But something new was awakening within them, a sense of identity, ambition, and legacy. A time was coming when mortals would begin to shape their own myths, not merely receive them. This shifting world gave rise to beings who stood between gods and mortals, figures whose actions would echo through legends. These were the heroes, men born with extraordinary qualities, sometimes from divine descent, sometimes from sheer force of will. They were not gods, but they were not ordinary mortals either. They bled, aged, suffered, and died, some, yet during their lifetimes they performed deeds that leapt beyond the limits of human capacity. They carried the fire of Prometheus not only in their hands but in their spirits. The first of these heroes emerged when the world was still young and fear still outweighed knowledge. One such hero was Perseus, born of a mortal woman and fathered by Zeus himself. His mother Danae had been imprisoned by her father, King Acrisius of Argos, who feared a prophecy that Danae's son would one day kill him. But prophecies move through the world like wind, unseen but unstoppable. Zeus, taking the form of golden light, visited Danae, and from their union Perseus was born. Acrisius, terrified, locked mother and child in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea. Yet fate, which even kings cannot escape, delivered them safely to the island of Seriphos. Perseus grew strong, guided not only by mortal experience but also by divine purpose. When Perseus came of age, he was tasked with what seemed an impossible challenge, to slay Medusa, the Gorgon, whose gaze turned men to stone. With Athena's guidance and Hermes' gifts, he sought the creature that lurked beyond the borders of the known world. His journey introduced a new kind of mythic journey, not one of gods battling cosmic forces, but of a mortal confronting the supernatural with courage and cunning. Perseus succeeded, carrying Medusa's head across the sky, rescuing a maiden named Andromeda from a sea monster, and fulfilling the prophecy that led to his birth. Through him, the Greeks saw the potential of man to confront fear and claim destiny. Another hero soon followed, Heracles, whose name echoed across mountains and seas. Born to Zeus and a mortal woman named Alcmene, he was destined for greatness even before his first breath. Hera, furious at Zeus's infidelity, hated the child from the moment he was conceived. She sent serpents to kill him in his cradle, but the infant Heracles strangled them with his bare hands. As he grew, his strength became legendary, unmatched by any man or beast. His life was marked by struggle, madness, redemption, and toil. The gods burdened him with 12 labors, tasks so difficult they seemed designed to break him, yet he completed each one. He conquered lions, wrestled monsters, captured sacred animals, and journeyed to the underworld itself. Through suffering, Heracles became not only a hero, but a symbol of endurance. His story resonated deeply in the ancient world, reminding Europeans centuries later that greatness often comes through hardship. Parallel to these rising heroes, the first civilizations began to form. Settlements grew into towns, towns into city-states. Mortals discovered the art of governance, crafting systems that mirrored the divine hierarchy of Olympus. Councils of elders emerged, echoing the gatherings of gods. Laws were written, echoing the cosmic principles set by Zeus. These early polis communities became the cradle of Greek civilization, each with its own identity, values, and patron gods. Athena, seeing the rise of order among mortals, favored the founding of cities. None was more beloved to her than Athens, which would later become the beacon of Western philosophy, theater, and democracy. But in these early years, Athens was still a settlement fighting for survival, threatened by rival tribes and the uncertainties of nature. Athena guided its people, teaching them strategy, prudence, and the arts of governance. Her influence inspired innovations in architecture, pottery, agriculture, and justice. She was not only a goddess of wisdom but of civilization itself. While Athena shaped cities, Apollo shaped culture. His oracles became the bridges between man and divine intention. The most sacred of these was at Delphi, where a priestess inhaled the vapors of the earth and spoke in riddles that kings interpreted as prophecies. Mortals traveled from distant lands to seek Apollo's guidance. The oracle became a unifying force, a center of pilgrimage that connected the fragmented world of early Greece. Through prophecy, mortals gained the courage to embark on quests, negotiate alliances, or wage war. Apollo's influence reached deep into the hearts of men, shaping their fears, hopes, and ambitions. But with the rise of humanity came new challenges. Zeus watched as mortals grew in number and complexity. He saw their wars, their greed, their pride. He feared they would forget the gods, as children forget the parents who raised them. So he intervened, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. He sent storms that punished arrogance, plagues that reminded mortals of their fragility, and signs that forced kings to reconsider their ambitions. The gods became not only creators but regulators of human life. Despite divine intervention, human conflicts intensified. Tribes clashed over fertile land, rivers, and access to trade routes. Kings rose and fell, each attempting to carve his place in history. Temples were built to Zeus, Athena, Poseidon, and other gods, each structure a testament to the growing relationship between mortals and the divine. As human architecture became more sophisticated, so did human identity. Myths became not only explanations for natural phenomena, but narratives that shaped ethics, law, and social customs. During this period, new heroes emerged, not always born of gods, but shaped by the world's turmoil. One such figure was Theseus, whose story belonged to the next generation of mythic history. He would rescue Athens from tyranny, confront the Minotaur in the labyrinth of Crete, and unify the region of Attica. His life demonstrated the evolution of heroism, no longer merely the slaying of monsters, but the shaping of political identity. Theseus symbolized the transition from tribal survival to state-building, a theme deeply embedded in European historical consciousness. And yet, for all the beauty and advancement that blossomed across the world, humanity remained vulnerable. The hardships released from Pandora's jar, disease, hunger, jealousy, violence, continued to haunt their lives. But hope, the one spirit left inside the jar, lingered in their hearts. It flickered in their nights like the fire Prometheus had given them. It pushed them to rebuild after disaster, to love despite loss, to seek knowledge and truth. Hope turned suffering into resilience, and resilience into culture. As humans cultivated fields and built cities, they also cultivated memory. They created songs to honor heroes, poems to honor gods, and rituals to honor the cycles of nature. Storytelling became a tool for survival, a way to preserve wisdom, celebrate triumphs, and warn against mistakes. Myth-making was not merely entertainment, it was the foundation of civilization. Through myths, mortals learned courage from Perseus, perseverance from Heracles, strategy from Athena, and humility from the fates of those who defied the gods. The gods, in turn, were shaped by these stories. As mortals retold the tales, the gods gained new attributes, personalities, and significance. Zeus became the embodiment of justice, Athena the ideal of wisdom, Apollo the voice of clarity, Artemis the protector of the wild. Mortals created temples not only to worship, but to participate in the divine narrative. Festivals, sacrifices, and games celebrated the bond between heaven and earth. In these early centuries, the line between divine and human was still thin. Gods walked among mortals in disguise, observing them, aiding them, or punishing them depending on circumstance. Humans encountered deities in forests, rivers, mountains, and dreams. The natural world pulsed with divine presence. Thunder was Zeus's voice, waves were Poseidon's hands, moonlight was Artemis's gaze. Even the quiet moments, a breeze, a harvest, a child's birth, were believed to be touched by the gods. As the mortal world blossomed, Olympus began to change as well. The gods debated how much influence they should exert. Some, like Athena and Apollo, advocated for guidance and inspiration. Others, like Ares and Hera, believed that mortals should be reminded of divine power through discipline and consequence. Zeus stood between these extremes, attempting to maintain harmony. But harmony was fleeting in a world filled with personalities as strong and diverse as the gods themselves. Prometheus, still bound to his rock, watched the world change with unblinking sorrow. His punishment had not emptied him of love for humanity. If anything, witnessing their growth intensified his conviction that they were worth suffering for. His agony became part of the world's rhythm, a daily reminder that the price of enlightenment is high, but the reward is enduring. As centuries passed, humanity's torch grew brighter. They built ships and set out across the Aegean Sea, discovering new islands and establishing trade routes. They constructed grand temples that reached towards the heavens. They developed early forms of writing, recording laws, prayers, and stories. The alphabet became a tool that allowed generations to communicate across time. Ideas no longer vanished with the death of their creators. They lived on in scrolls, in stone, in song. This period marked the dawn of the Age of Heroes, a golden chapter in mythic history when mortals and demigods performed deeds so extraordinary that their names would echo through millennia. These heroes symbolize the best and worst of human nature: bravery, ambition, loyalty, betrayal, love, rage, wisdom, and folly. Through them, the world learned that greatness often arises not from divine favor alone, but from human struggle. And as heroes rose, the gods watched with a mixture of pride and fear. For every hero who served the gods, there was another who challenged them. Their stories became the battleground between human aspiration and divine authority. In the age to come, heroes would build kingdoms, slay monsters, journey to the ends of the earth, and confront both gods and fate. The world was ready for its epics, ready for the tales of Jason and the Argonauts, for the tragedy of Oedipus, for the war of Troy, for the wanderings of Odysseus. But before these legends would unfold, mankind had to pass through one more threshold, the moment when human ambition rose high enough to shake Olympus itself. Part by part, story by story, humanity was stepping out of the shadow of creation and into the light of destiny. The gods had made the world and shaped its laws. But from this point forward, mortals would shape history. As the centuries turned and mortals slowly emerged from the fragile dawn of civilization, the Greek world began to take shape, not through peaceful cultivation alone, but through the constant clash of ambition, survival, and the restless human spirit. Valleys filled with settlements that would one day become cities, and the tribes that first huddled around firelight gradually formed societies with unique identities. Some dwelt near the sea, relying on trade and fishing. Others settled in mountainous regions, mastering the difficult life of shepherds and hunters. While the gods had created earth and sky, mortals were now creating culture, the human echo of divine order. Greece at this time was not a united land but a tapestry of small kingdoms, each ruled by a king whose lineage claimed divine ancestry. These realms were connected by a shared language, shared rituals, and shared fears. They offered sacrifices to the same gods, read omens in the same stars, and interpreted dreams through the same symbols. And yet each kingdom had its own laws, rivalries, and ambitions. The seeds of what would later become the Greek city-states, the polis, were already germinating beneath the soil of this era. In Argos, Mycenae, Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and countless other regions, mortal rulers attempted to bring stability to their lands. But stability, like everything in Greek myth, was rarely granted freely. The world was still young enough that monsters wandered freely across plains and mountains. Winged creatures nested near riverbanks, serpentine beasts slithered through forests, giants roamed the edges of human habitation. The remnants of earlier ages, the monstrous offspring of Gaia, the children of Typhon, the cursed forms created by divine punishment, still inhabited the world, threatening to devour the fragile achievements of mankind. It was in this dangerous era that the first epic heroes stepped forth. Their stories were not merely feats of strength, but acts of cultural transformation. Every monster slain allowed a kingdom to expand. Every labyrinth conquered allowed a city to flourish. Every tyrant overthrown allowed justice to grow. Heroes were not ornaments of myth. They were the architects of civilization, the bridge between divine potential and human reality. Among these early heroes, few shone more brightly than Perseus, whose tale had already begun in the previous chapter. After slaying Medusa and rescuing Andromeda, he returned to Greece with a reputation that echoed across kingdoms. Yet even Perseus, with all his divine favor, discovered that myths rarely allow their heroes simple endings. His return to Argos fulfilled the prophecy that his birth had set in motion. He accidentally killed his grandfather Acrisius during athletic games, not through malice but through fate's cold guidance. The Greeks understood this deeply. The threads of life are woven in ways mortals cannot predict, and even heroes cannot escape the design of destiny. Perseus later founded the city of Mycenae, preparing the groundwork for a kingdom that would dominate Greece for centuries. This single act, one hero establishing a city, was more than a story. It symbolized the shift from wandering tribes to structured societies. Cities allowed laws, wealth, art, and culture to flourish. They became the stages upon which human greatness could unfold. While Perseus shaped Argos and Mycenae, another hero was rising in a different corner of Greece, Bellerophon, whose tale combined ambition with tragedy in the most classical sense. Born a prince of Corinth, he possessed a youthful brilliance that bordered on arrogance. Fate soon thrust him into trials that would either elevate him among the greatest of mortals or destroy him entirely. Wrongly exiled for a crime he did not commit, he sought purification from King Proetus of Tiryns. But Proetus' wife, drawn by the hero's beauty, falsely accused him of seduction. Unable to kill a guest under his roof, Proetus sent Bellerophon to the king of Lycia with a letter requesting the young man's death. Yet fate spared him. Instead of execution, Bellerophon was given a task that seemed impossible: slay the Chimera, a monstrous fire-breathing creature with a lion's head, a goat's body, and a serpent's tail. To defeat such a beast required more than skill. It required divine intervention. With Athena's guidance, Bellerophon tamed Pegasus, the winged horse born from Medusa's blood. Together they soared into the sky and confronted the Chimera from above, striking with precision until the monstrous body collapsed. But triumph often turns to tragedy. Empowered by success, Bellerophon grew arrogant. He believed he deserved a place on Olympus and attempted to ride Pegasus into the heavens. Zeus, angered by such hubris, sent a gadfly to sting the horse. Pegasus reared, and Bellerophon fell. He survived but lived the rest of his days crippled and blind, wandering alone, a reminder that even heroes must respect the boundary between mortal and divine. Despite the tragic ending, Bellerophon's tale remained a cornerstone of Greek identity. Europeans centuries later saw in him the ancient warning against overreaching ambition, a theme echoed in medieval morality plays, in the tragedies of Shakespeare, and in the philosophical writings of the Enlightenment. But perhaps no early hero left a deeper impact on the Greek world than Theseus, the son of Aegeus, king of Athens. Unlike Perseus and Heracles, Theseus was not simply a slayer of monsters, but a statesman, a reformer, and a unifier. His story represented the growing maturity of human civilization, the shift from heroic survival to organized governance. Theseus's journey began long before he reached Athens. Raised by his mother Aethra in the city of Troezen, he grew up unaware of his royal heritage. Beneath a great stone, his father had concealed a sword and sandals, instructing that only when Theseus was strong enough to lift the stone should he come to claim his place. When he finally achieved the feat, he set out for Athens not by sea, the safe and common route, but by land, where dangers thrived. The path was filled with bandits and monstrous men. Theseus confronted each with a sense of justice that would shape his legacy. He defeated Perfides, the club wielder, Cenas, who bent pine trees to fling victims to their deaths, and Procrustes, the sadist who forced travelers to fit his iron bed by stretching or cutting them. In defeating them, Theseus symbolically purged the roads of lawlessness, allowing trade and communication to flourish. His arrival in Athens was fraught with political tension. Aegeus's new wife, Medea, yes, the same Medea whose story would later intertwine with Jason's, saw Theseus as a threat and attempted to poison him. When the plot failed, Theseus was recognized and embraced as the rightful heir. Yet his greatest challenge lay not in Athens but across the sea in Crete. For years, Athens had been forced to pay tribute to King Minos of Crete. 7 young men and 7 young women sent to be devoured by the Minotaur, a monstrous creature born from divine punishment and imprisoned in a labyrinth constructed by Daedalus. Theseus volunteered to end the suffering. With the help of Minos' daughter, Ariadne, who fell in love with him, he navigated the labyrinth using a thread as a guide, faced the Minotaur, and slew it. This victory marked a turning point in Greek identity, reason and courage triumphing over chaos and fear. Yet Theseus's life, like the lives of all heroes, was filled with contradiction. He abandoned Ariadne on Naxos under mysterious circumstances. Some say he feared offending the gods, others say he simply lost interest. On his return to Athens, he forgot to raise the white sails that would signal his survival. Seeing the black sails, King Aegeus leapt to his death from a cliff, giving his name to the Aegean Sea. Theseus became king, later unifying Attica into a single political entity. His legacy symbolized the beginning of true governance, the transition from tribal rule to structured society. The Greeks viewed these early heroes not as perfect figures but as complex ones. They were praised for their courage and condemned for their flaws. Their stories were lessons for mortals, reminders of the fragile balance between ambition and humility. For Europeans who later inherited these myths, these heroes became symbols of human potential. Their victories were celebrated, their tragedies analyzed, their journeys became metaphors in philosophy, literature, and art. As these heroes rose and fell, the mortal world grew stronger. Mycenaean. Palaces were built on hilltops, fortified with stone walls described by later generations as Cyclopean due to their massive size. Trade expanded across the Mediterranean. Ships sailed to Egypt, the Levant, and Asia Minor. Bronze weapons and tools allowed armies to grow stronger and farmers more efficient. Pottery became more refined, with geometric patterns that symbolized the order the Greeks sought to impose on their chaotic world. Writing systems began to develop, early ancestors of the alphabets that would shape Europe's languages, yet prosperity was never far from danger. Droughts struck, earthquakes shook the land. Rival kings plotted alliances or betrayals. In the shadows of forests and mountains, creatures born of older ages still lurked. Not all monsters were physical, many were political, psychological, or moral. The Greeks understood that civilization itself is a fragile thing, built on the delicate balance between strength and wisdom, fear and hope. Throughout this era, the gods remained deeply entwined with human affairs. Some gods grew closer to specific cities, shaping their destinies. Athena devoted herself to Athens, guiding its kings and inspiring its laws. Apollo favored Delphi, turning it into the center of spiritual and political life. Poseidon guided sailors and punished tyrants who boasted of controlling the seas. Aphrodite influenced marriages and alliances. Hermes fostered trade and diplomacy. Ares reveled in conflicts as kingdoms fought for power. But divine favor could shift in a moment. The gods were unpredictable, their passions as volatile as those of the mortals who worshipped them. A minor slight could provoke divine anger. A single offering could earn divine blessing. The Greeks lived in a world where heaven was never silent and fate never still. As kingdoms rose and heroes performed their deeds, the stage was being set for something far greater, a saga that would unite all Greek tribes in a single moment of shared destiny. The seeds of this future were already growing in the stories of Theseus, Perseus, and Bellerophon. Their cities, Athens, Argos, and Corinth, would one day play crucial roles in the epic that would define an entire civilization. For now, however, these early years continued to unfold with all the unpredictability of human ambition. Families sought protection under the gods. Kings consulted oracles before making decisions. Warriors prayed before battle, hoping for favor. Women offered sacrifices for healthy childbirth. Farmers prayed for rain. Poets began to weave early versions of the myths that would centuries later become epic poetry. Slowly, a cultural network began to form. A shared Greek identity built not on political unity, but on shared stories. The gods, the heroes, the monsters, the moral lessons, they all stitched together the fabric of Hellenic culture. Even distant tribes who had never met could recognize each other through these tales. By the time the Age of Heroes reached its height, the world had transformed from scattered villages to powerful kingdoms. The gods watched from Olympus with a mixture of fascination and fear. They knew that as mortals grew more advanced, the line between human greatness and divine defiance became thinner. Heroes were no longer simply slayers of beasts. They were founders of cities, creators of culture, shapers of destiny. They stood closer to the gods than any generation before them. But with this rise came the inevitable shadow, the growing possibility of conflict not only among mortals, but between mortals and gods. Ambition, after all, is the flame that both builds and destroys. Heroes reached for glory, kings reached for land, and gods reached for relevance. The world was moving toward its first great collective myth, the moment when Greece would no longer be a land of isolated stories, but a single theater of war and heroism. The threads of fate were gathering into a pattern, one that would involve kings from every region, gods from every realm, and consequences that would shape the future of Greece for centuries. The Age of Heroes was approaching its climax. And soon the world would hear the whisper of a name that would ignite the greatest epic ever sung. A war not of survival, but of pride, vengeance, destiny, and divine manipulation. As the Age of Heroes unfolded across the lands of Greece, a subtle shift began in the rhythm of the world, as though destiny itself was drawing breath before a storm. The scattered tales of heroes, of Perseus, Theseus, Bellerophon, and countless others, were no longer isolated stories, but threads weaving themselves into a single tapestry. Through alliances, marriages, oaths, and rivalries, Greece was inching toward a moment of convergence, and the gods watched as mortals unknowingly approached the turning point of an era. Among the mortals destined to take center stage in this great shift were children born not merely of kings, but of gods and kings together. These rare individuals, half mortal, half divine, carried within themselves the tension between human fragility and celestial expectation. No figure embodied this tension more strongly than Helen, a woman whose beauty would one day set nations ablaze. But Helen's story did not begin with war. It began with an act of divine mischief, one of the many that marked Zeus's reign. In the form of a swan chased by an eagle, he sought refuge with Leda, queen of Sparta. Their union, mysterious and symbolic, resulted in the birth of children unlike any others. Helen and Polydeuces from Zeus, and Castor and Clytemnestra from her mortal husband Tyndareus. Helen from her earliest days seemed touched by an otherworldly light. Even as a child she drew the gazes of kings, warriors, and poets. The whispers of her beauty traveled far beyond the mountains of Sparta, stirring curiosity and desire across the Greek world. Growing up under the watchful eyes of the Spartan palace, Helen learned grace, diplomacy, and the responsibilities of royal lineage. She was not merely admired, she was coveted. Suitors arrived at the Spartan court from every corner of Greece. Some came hoping for political alliances, others for glory, and others still for the simple and dangerous desire to possess what no man had any right to claim. Among them were some of the greatest men of the age: Ajax of Salamis, Idomeneus of Crete, Odysseus of Ithaca, and Menelaus of Mycenaean blood. Tyndareus, wise enough to foresee chaos on the horizon, hesitated. For whichever suitor he chose, the others would become enemies. And so, on the advice of the clever Odysseus, he devised the Oath of Tyndareus, a pact unseen before in Greek history. Each suitor swore a sacred vow, one binding not only their honor, but their very lives, that whomever Helen married, all others would defend the chosen husband and his rights. It was a strange peace forged out of shared desire and reluctant restraint, and yet, like all oaths born of human emotion, it held within it the seeds of future destruction. Helen chose Menelaus, the reddish-haired brother of Agamemnon, whose wealth and calm authority appealed to her more than brute strength or clever trickery. As she became queen of Sparta, a fragile harmony settled over Greece, though it was more fragile than any realized. The gods were not done with her. They had merely placed her at the center of a cosmic design that would soon spiral far beyond mortal understanding. Across the Aegean Sea in the wealthy city of Troy, another royal child was being shaped by prophecy: Paris, son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba. His birth was shadowed by an omen. Hecuba dreamt she gave birth to a flaming torch that burned down the city. Interpreting this as a sign that the child would bring ruin to Troy, Priam ordered the infant to be abandoned on Mount Ida. Yet fate, ever unyielding, intervened. A shepherd found the child, took pity on him, and raised him as his own. Paris grew up far from the palace, surrounded not by golden columns but by forests, pastures, and the gentle rhythms of pastoral life. In these quiet surroundings he became skilled with animals, known for his fairness, and admired for his beauty. The gods noticed him long before Troy did. It was this unnoticed prince, untainted by the ambitions of kings, whom the gods chose for one of the most consequential judgments in mythic history. The moment began not on earth, but at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, an event celebrated by gods and mortals alike. Yet one goddess, Eris, Discord, was not invited. In her spite, she cast a golden apple into the hall, inscribed with 3 dangerous words: "To the fairest." Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite each claimed it. When Zeus refused to choose among them, fearing the consequences of offending any one of them, he appointed Paris, the shepherd prince, as judge. The 3 goddesses descended upon Mount Ida, each offering Paris gifts as bribes. Hera promised vast power, rule over all of Asia. Athena promised unmatched wisdom and victory in war. But Aphrodite, in a whisper soft as velvet, offered him the love of the most beautiful woman alive. Paris, destined to be ruled by the heart rather than the sword or the crown, chose Aphrodite, and with that choice the fate of nations was sealed. For Aphrodite's promised woman was Helen of Sparta, already married, already bound by the oath of Tyndareus, already the center of a kingdom's pride. Paris's journey to Sparta began as a diplomatic visit, not as an act of war. Menelaus welcomed him with honor, offering gifts and shelter. But beauty and destiny have always been volatile forces. Whether Helen left willingly or was seduced, or whether Aphrodite clouded her mind with divine enchantment, the result was the same. She sailed with Paris back to Troy, abandoning her marriage, her throne, and the delicate peace that had held Greece together. When Menelaus discovered her absence, rage consumed him. He invoked the oath of Tyndareus. One by one, the suitors who had once bowed before Helen now prepared for war. Ships were built, weapons forged, alliances rekindled, and at the center stood Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, who saw in this oath an opportunity not only for revenge but for expansion, an empire forged under Greek unity. Before the fleet could sail, however, an unsettling calm fell upon the port. No wind stirred, the sea lay still as if refusing to carry men toward their doom. The seer Calchas revealed the reason. Artemis had been offended, perhaps by a boast or perhaps by blood spilled unjustly, and demanded the sacrifice of Iphigenia, Agamemnon's own daughter. The story of her fate would later become one of the darkest tragedies in Greek memory. Whether she was killed or saved by divine intervention, the fleet eventually sailed, and the 1,000 ships crossed the wine-dark sea toward Troy. As the Greek army gathered on the shores of Asia Minor, the world seemed to hold its breath. Never before had so many warriors assembled for a single cause. It was a moment unprecedented in mortal history, kings united under a shared oath, heroes standing shoulder to shoulder, and gods watching with intensity rarely seen since the battles of the Titans. Troy, at the same time, prepared not merely for siege but for survival. Priam, wise and aged, gathered his sons, Hector, Paris, Deiphobus, Helenus, Troilus, and weighed their counsel. Troy was not just a city, it was a symbol of wealth, honor, and ancient lineage. Its walls, built by Poseidon and Apollo, were thought unbreakable. But unbreakable walls have never stopped fate from finding its way inside. Among the Trojans, Hector stood as a beacon of strength and dignity. Unlike Paris, whose actions sprang from desire, Hector lived by duty. He fought not for glory but for his people, his wife Andromache, and their infant son Astyanax. He saw the war not as a stage for heroism, but as a looming tragedy. Even as he comforted his wife, he confessed he knew he would die. Yet he embraced his fate, for honor demanded it. The Greeks admired him, the Trojans depended on him, the gods respected him, but destiny would not spare even the most noble of men. As the Greek fleet approached the Trojan shore, the first clash came like the first notes of a vast symphony of violence. The warriors leapt from their ships as the Trojans charged down from the citadel. Fighting erupted on the sands, shields clashing, spears thrusting, dust rising in swirling clouds. To the east and west, the mountains and sea watched impassively, silent witnesses to humanity's greatest conflict. Achilles, the greatest of the Greeks, entered the war with young fury. His mother Thetis had dipped him in the river Styx to make him invulnerable, save for the heel she held him by. His presence alone intimidated armies, yet even he was not immune to pride and conflict. A quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon over a captive woman would eventually bring the entire Greek army to the brink of annihilation, teaching the world that even the greatest warriors were prisoners of their own tempers. The war itself did not unfold as a single grand battle, but as a long, grinding agony. Armies clashed on the plain. Sieges were attempted and repelled. Raids were launched against surrounding cities. Heroes fought duels that became tales whispered by firesides. And always the gods interfered. Some out of loyalty, others out of jealousy, and many simply out of curiosity. Hera and Athena backed the Greeks. Aphrodite and Apollo shielded the Trojans. Zeus attempted to remain neutral but found himself pulled by prophecy and passion into the tangled web of destiny. Throughout these early years of conflict, Helen lived within the walls of Troy, her presence both a blessing and a curse. Some citizens adored her beauty, others blamed her for the war, many feared her as a living omen. She herself wandered between guilt and resignation. She had not chosen to become the symbol of a continent's rage, yet she could not escape the role thrust upon her. In the Greek camp, old friendships deepened and new rivalries grew. Odysseus counseled wisdom where others sought brute force. Ajax towered like a storm cloud, unshakable in battle but tormented by pride. Diomedes became a vessel of divine fury, even wounding Ares and Aphrodite themselves in combat. Patroclus, dear companion to Achilles, watched helplessly as the Greeks suffered without Achilles in the field. Heroes died on both sides, each funeral burning brighter than the last. Yet despite the blood spilled, the war seemed no closer to ending. The walls of Troy held firm. The will of the gods remained divided. Fate moved slowly but relentlessly like a mountain shadow creeping across the plains. Still, the threads of tragedy were tightening. Paris had won Helen, but he could not protect Troy. Hector fought bravely, but he could not save his family. Achilles fought fiercely, but he could not escape his destiny, and Agamemnon commanded the mightiest army ever seen, yet he could not control the unraveling consequences of his ambition. All of Greece and all of Troy stood at the edge of an abyss made not by gods or monsters but by human desire, divine intervention, and the inexorable weight of destiny. For beyond the horizon unseen by mortal eyes, the final chapters were already being written. The war would not be decided by strength alone, nor by wisdom, nor by loyalty. Its end would come through deception, ingenuity, sacrifice, betrayal, and the breaking of ancient bonds. And in the distance, hidden in the shadow of fate, the wooden horse had already begun to take shape, not from wood or nails, but from prophecy, pride, and the slow-burning fire of vengeance. The world's greatest myth was approaching its darkest hour. The ninth year of the war settled over the plains of Troy like a slow-moving storm, heavy and suffocating. The once green fields were trampled into dust, the streams ran cloudy with ashes, and the wind carried with it the distant sorrow of funeral pyres. What had begun as a swift campaign to reclaim a stolen queen had become a grinding test of endurance. A war fought not only with bronze and fire, but with pride, longing, and the fragile threads of sanity that held men together. Even the gods, watching from their thrones and clouds, seemed wearied by the endless rage of mortals. Achilles, the greatest of the Greeks, remained absent from the battlefield. His quarrel with Agamemnon over Perseus had become a fault line splitting the Greek forces, and though the Greeks still fought bravely, their battles carried the dull echo of desperation. Without Achilles, the momentum had shifted. Hector led the Trojans with a steady, relentless grace that earned him admiration even among his enemies. Every morning his chariot wheels cut new grooves into the earth. Every night he returned to the city, greeted by anxious glances, hopeful prayers, and the quiet strength of his wife Andromache. Yet within Hector's heart lay a truth he could never speak aloud. He knew that the war, as long as Achilles refused to fight, favored Troy. But he also sensed that this blessing was temporary, a brief shelter before an inevitable storm. For fate does not grant reprieves, it merely delays its price. And Hector, with every victory, felt the weight of destiny pressing tighter upon him. Inside the Greek camp, the absence of Achilles created a strange, echoing emptiness. His tent stood quiet, the armor within gathering dust, the Myrmidons restless. Patroclus, friend and companion since childhood, moved like a shadow between duty and concern. He understood Achilles more deeply than anyone alive. He knew that beneath the hero's wrath lay a young man wounded by pride, by longing for honor, by the sting of betrayal. But Patroclus also knew what the Greek army did not. Achilles would not be moved by orders, nor threats, nor even pleas. Only meaning could summon him, and meaning had grown scarce in a war driven by ego. Meanwhile, Agamemnon watched his army weaken with a mixture of frustration and fear. He had believed that kingship granted him natural authority, yet the war had shown him that power without loyalty is brittle. His decision to seize Perseus had wounded Achilles, yes, but it had also wounded the Greeks themselves. Thousands now paid the price for a dispute between two men too proud to bend, and though Agamemnon would never admit it aloud, he feared the consequences of his actions. He feared that history, if written at all, would remember him not as a ruler of men, but as the man who broke his own army. As the 10th year approached, the Trojans pressed their advantage. Their newfound confidence swelled beneath the banners of Apollo. Paris, buoyed by divine favor, loosed arrows from the walls. Deiphobus and Helenus marshaled the warriors at the gates. Even Aeneas, guided by dreams and omens, led daring charges that shook the Greek lines. And at the forefront of every assault stood Hector, the shining helm of Troy, whose spear struck with both precision and necessity. The Greeks, for the first time since they landed on Trojan soil, found themselves forced back toward their ships, those long black silhouettes that had once carried them across the sea with songs of victory. Now the ships stood like trapped beasts awaiting slaughter. Smoke curled above the Greek camp as Trojans lit fires along the battlefield's edge, attempting to burn the fleet and end the war not with honor, but with annihilation. It was in this moment of desperation that Patroclus turned to Achilles, pleading not as a soldier to a commander, but as a friend to a friend. The cries of dying men reached their ears. The flickering orange of burning ships painted the night sky. Patroclus's voice trembled, not with fear, but with compassion. "If you will not fight," he said softly, "then let me go in your place." Achilles stared at him, wounded pride battling against the deeper wound of grief for lost honor. At last, in a moment that would shape the fate of nations, he agreed. He lent Patroclus his armor that gleamed like the promise of salvation, and sent him forth with a final warning. "Drive the Trojans from the ships. Do not pursue them to the walls." Patroclus, wearing the mantle of the greatest warrior alive, rode into battle like a spark carried by the wind. The Greek army, seeing what they believed to be Achilles returned, surged forward with renewed fury. Trojans faltered under the weight of the illusion. Panic rippled across the plain as word spread. Achilles had returned. Even Hector hesitated, feeling for the first time the cold shadow of fear. Patroclus's spear found its mark over and over, driving the Trojans back, lifting morale from the ashes. The flames consuming the Greek ships sputtered out under the wave of counter-assault. For a moment, it seemed that the tide of war had turned once more, pulled back from the brink by courage and borrowed armor. But youth and passion are often close cousins to folly. Drunk with victory, Patroclus forgot Achilles' warning. He pursued the Trojans all the way to the gates of Troy. In that moment, Apollo, the archer god, protector of the city, reached out a divine hand. As Patroclus raised his spear to climb the walls, Apollo struck him from behind, stripping away his strength. His armor slipped from him like a discarded skin. Dazed, weaponless, exposed, Patroclus stumbled into the dust. Hector found him there, and though he did not yet know it was not Achilles, he delivered the killing blow. Patroclus died with a whisper on his lips, naming Achilles and warning Hector of what was to come. When word of Patroclus's death reached Achilles, something within him shattered beyond repair. The wrath he felt toward Agamemnon was nothing compared to the storm now raging inside him. He wept not quietly, but with the raw anguish of a man who has lost the one anchor that held his soul steady. His cries carried across the camp, across the sea, across the ears of the gods themselves. Even Thetis, deep beneath the waves, felt her son's agony, and rose to comfort him. Achilles returned to the battlefield transformed. Grief had stripped him of pride. Rage had replaced hesitation. Thetis brought him new armor forged by Hephaestus, a shield depicting the whole world from cities to harvest to stars. Achilles became a force not of war but of destiny. He cut down Trojans by the dozens, his spear moving with terrifying precision. Men fled at the sight of him. The river Scamander rose in protest, choked with corpses attempting to drown him. Even the gods clashed above the clouds as the conflict reached a fevered pitch. Hera against Artemis, Athena against Ares, Poseidon against Apollo. And still Achilles pressed on, seeking Hector. Hector, knowing his fate, did not hide. But as Achilles approached, glowing like a living flame, instinct overcame bravery. Hector fled, circling the walls of Troy 3 times before stopping at last, when Athena, disguised as his brother, deceived him into turning back. Realizing the betrayal only when it was too late, Hector faced Achilles with solemn resolve. Their duel was brief and brutal. Achilles fought like a man possessed, and Hector's skill could not match the divine armor and unyielding fury of his opponent. When Hector fell, the earth itself seemed to tremble. Achilles tied the dead prince's body to his chariot and dragged him around the walls in a display of rage that horrified even his own comrades. Inside Troy, Andromache collapsed at the sight, her cries rising above the din of mourning. Priam tore his robes, grieving not only for a son but for the coming doom of his city. Hecuba wept until her voice was gone. Paris looked upon the scene with guilt that had grown heavier year by year, and Helen, whose beauty had sparked the catastrophe, felt the full weight of sorrow settle like iron upon her heart. Yet even in this moment of vengeance, humanity lingered. That night, guided by Hermes, Priam entered the Greek camp alone. Kneeling before Achilles, he kissed the hands that had murdered his son and begged for Hector's body. Achilles, seeing not a king, but a grieving father, felt his hardened heart soften. Tears filled his eyes as he remembered his own father, aging far away in Phthia. He returned Hector's body, and for a moment the war paused, not in peace but in shared mourning. But sorrow, though powerful, does not stop the turning of fate. Achilles' time was approaching. Apollo had not forgotten the death of his beloved Hector. Paris, with divine help, loosed an arrow that struck Achilles in the heel, the only part of him left vulnerable. The hero fell, young and glorious, meeting the death foretold long before his birth. Greece mourned him as they had never mourned a warrior before. His funeral pyre burned high into the darkness, casting light across the sea as though guiding his soul to whatever realm awaited someone born of both mortal flesh and divine promise. Even Achilles' death did not end the cycle. Ajax and Odysseus quarreled over the hero's armor, a dispute that would lead to further tragedy. Agamemnon returned home only to be murdered in his own palace. Odysseus would wander for years, struggling not against Trojans but against gods, monsters, and the restless pull of identity. And Troy, though still standing, trembled under the weight of a fate now impossible to avert. The Trojan War was no longer a story of Helen or of Paris. It was not even a story of kings or armies. It had become a story of fate, how it pursues men across oceans, across battlefields, across the fragile borders of pride and grief. The heroes had made their choices, but destiny had made its judgment. As the dust settled over the plains and the fires flickered along the ramparts, the world prepared for the final act. The wooden horse had not yet been built. The gates had not yet been opened. But the shadows of the end were already lengthening, stretching across Troy like the wings of a nightbird gliding toward a doomed city. The world waited, breathless, for the fall. Night settled slowly over the plain of Troy, stretching its long shadows across the broken shields, the dented helmets, and the silent bodies that lay scattered like fallen leaves. The air was heavy with the exhaustion of 10 years of war. The Greeks, weary and spirit-worn, retreated behind their fortifications each evening, while the Trojans, equally battered, withdrew within their ancient walls. Both sides believed the conflict had reached a stalemate, a slow, painful suffocation rather than a decisive blow. Yet destiny rarely ends in stillness. It waits, gathering strength in quiet corners, preparing to strike when mortals least expect it. In the minds of the Greeks, Achilles' death had left a wound deeper than any inflicted by Trojan spears. The greatest warrior of the age lay in his tomb beside the sea, his cremated bones mixed with those of Patroclus, so they might rest together for eternity. The Greeks mourned him, but mourning did not heal their despair. Achilles had been their blade, their shield, and their pride. Without him, the war felt endless, hollow, without direction. Yet it was not strength of arms that would decide the war's end, but the quiet, cunning mind of a man who had always preferred thought to fury. Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, watched the conflict with eyes sharper than any spear. He saw that brute force had led the Greeks as far as it could. The walls of Troy, built by gods and strengthened by a decade of desperation, would not fall to direct assault. The Trojans were tired, yes, but not broken. And like a fox who waits for the right moment, Odysseus began to imagine a solution born not of violence, but of misdirection. Under the cover of darkness, he proposed a plan unlike anything conceived in the entire war. Not a weapon, but a deception so audacious that even the gods paused to listen. He envisioned a gift, a symbol of surrender, and a hidden dagger within that gift. A great wooden horse towering like a monument, seemingly left behind as a tribute to Athena, goddess of wisdom and war. But inside, concealed in its hollow belly, the Greeks would place their finest warriors, unseen and silent, and at the right moment they would emerge to open the gates of Troy, allowing the full army to return from its hidden place beyond the horizon. The council of Greek kings reacted with a mixture of awe, suspicion, and fear. Some argued it was madness, that no city would be foolish enough to accept such a token. Others doubted the craftsmanship required to build such a massive structure. Still others, exhausted by the war, agreed simply because they had no better hope. But the plan carried a whisper of destiny. It felt like a story already written in the hearts of the fates. And so the Greeks began their final act. The shipwright Epeus, guided by Athena, carved the massive horse from the timbers of ships. Its flanks were smooth, its posture noble, its eyes carved with deceptive lifelike calm. From a distance, it appeared to be a gift worthy of a goddess, a monument to the end of conflict. Inside, however, it housed men whose names would later echo in legend: Odysseus, Menelaus, Neoptolemus, Diomedes, Thoas, and others chosen for their stealth and ferocity. They climbed inside with grim determination, knowing that a single mistake could end in slaughter. When the horse was completed, the Greeks executed the second part of Odysseus's plan. They burned their tents, dismantled their camp, and sailed away as if abandoning the war entirely. Only a single Greek, Sinon, remained behind, playing the role of a desperate deserter. The stage was set. At dawn, the Trojans climbed their walls and saw an astonishing sight. The Greek camp was deserted. The ships had vanished into the horizon. All that remained on the shore was the strange towering horse. Silence fell across the battlements as disbelief swept over the city. After 10 years of war, could this truly be the end? Some cried for celebration, others urged caution. Among them was Laocoon, a priest of Poseidon whose instincts sensed danger. He approached the horse cautiously, his eyes darkened by suspicion. "Beware of Greeks even when they bear gifts," he warned, his voice echoing across the plain. To test the object, he hurled his spear into its side. For a moment the wood rang with a hollow sound, and inside, the hidden warriors bit their tongues to keep silent. At that moment, fate intervened with terrifying finality. From the sea rose two great serpents, their coils glistening with brine, their eyes burning like embers. They rushed toward Laocoon and his sons, crushing them in their terrible embrace. The Trojans, horrified, interpreted the scene as divine punishment for disrespecting a sacred offering. Athena, still enraged at Troy, had arranged the scene to silence the only voice of wisdom among them. The horse was declared a holy object. Priam, elderly and trusting, ordered it to be brought into the city as a symbol of the gods' favor. The people of Troy, swept by excitement and relief, pulled the horse through the gates with ropes and laughter. Children danced beside it, women cast flowers before its wooden hooves, priests blessed it, and as night fell, Troy gave itself to celebration for the first time in a decade. Wine flowed, fires burned, songs echoed through the streets. Helen wandered among the revelers, her face illuminated by torchlight, her heart heavy with unspoken dread. Some claimed she approached the horse, calling out the names of Greek warriors in a testing voice, but no one inside answered. They remained still as stone, their breath shallow, their hands gripping sword hilts in the dark. When the revelry faded and torches dimmed to embers, Troy slept. Its walls, which had withstood 10 years of siege, now guarded the very instrument of its doom. Midnight deepened, the winds fell still, and from within the belly of the horse came the soft sound of movement, quiet as a heartbeat. Odysseus gave the signal. A hatch opened. One by one, the Greek warriors climbed down, their forms barely visible in the moonlight. They dispatched the guards with silent strikes and rushed to the gates, swinging them wide to the sea. Far away, hidden behind the island of Tenedos, the Greek fleet unfurled its sails and returned under the cover of darkness. The ships moved swiftly, like ghosts returning to claim vengeance. When they reached the shore, thousands of soldiers poured forth, storming through the open gates. Troy awoke not to dawn, but to fire. The Greek armies surged through the city, swords flashing, shields clattering, torches blazing. Houses burned as flames leapt. From rooftop to rooftop, Priam's palace shook with screams and collapsing beams. Warriors cut through streets that had once been filled with laughter and music. Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, became a tempest of brutality. Fueled by inherited rage and divine cruelty, he stormed through the palace and confronted Priam at the altar of Zeus. The old king, too frail to fight, clung to the statue of the god. But Neoptolemus struck him down, spilling the blood of Troy's past upon the sacred stones. Elsewhere in the city, Cassandra, cursed prophetess, foresaw everything, yet could prevent nothing. Dragged from the temple of Athena despite her screams, she was taken by Ajax, the Lesser, who committed sacrilege in the very house of the goddess. His crime sealed his doom, for Athena would later call the storm that drowned him. Hecuba, once queen, watched her children die one by one, her heart fracturing into grief so deep that later legends claim she transformed into a howling dog of sorrow, wandering the ruins of her home. And in another corner of the city, Aeneas, carrying his aged father Anchises upon his back and holding his young son by the hand, fled through the smoke-filled alleys under divine guidance. Behind him, his wife Creusa was lost in the chaos, her ghost appearing only to bid him farewell. Aeneas's escape would become the seed of another empire, another destiny, another age. Helen, the woman whose beauty had sparked the war, found herself standing face to face with Menelaus. But whether he raised his sword or dropped it, overwhelmed by love or pity, has been told in many ways. What is known is that she survived, returning to Sparta to live out her days in uneasy peace, her name forever intertwined with the ruin of a great city. By dawn, it was over. Troy, which for centuries had stood as a symbol of wealth, culture, and divine favor, was reduced to blackened stone and mourning ash. Smoke curled into the sky. The cries of the dying faded into silence. The once proud towers lay in broken heaps, and the golden plains that surrounded the city were littered with the remnants of war, shattered weapons, splintered chariots, and footprints leading either toward freedom or toward death. The Greeks had won, but it was a victory without triumph. They had slain heroes, toppled walls, and carried treasures onto their ships. Yet the gods had seen their hubris, the desecration of temples, the cruelty shown to innocents, the blood spilled without reverence, and the gods would not forget. As the Greeks sailed home, storms rose, winds scattered their fleets, waves swallowed ships whole. Many would never see their native shores again, for the fall of Troy was not merely the end of a war, it was the end of an age, the heroic age, where gods walked among men, where honor was worth more than life, where fate spoke through omens and oracles. That world collapsed with the city's walls. What rose from its ashes was a humbler age, ruled less by divine fire, and more by the quiet persistence of human endurance. The plains of Troy would one day fall silent. Grass would grow where blood once flowed. Shepherds would wander where kings once battled. And poets, centuries later, would sing of the great city that burned in a single night, not out of hatred but out of the tragedy of human desire. Troy became a memory, then a myth, then a symbol. It lived not in stone but in the stories told by generations, stories of love, pride, rage, courage, betrayal, and destiny. A city destroyed by men but immortalized by words. And as the morning light crept across the smoking ruins, the world quietly turned the page. The gods remained, but distant. The heroes had fallen, their names carved into eternity. And the winds that drifted across the desolate plain carried with them the final echo of a story that would shape all stories after. The age of legends had ended. Another age was waiting. When Troy fell beneath the weight of Greek fury, the world did not rejoice. Victory tasted strange, metallic, and hollow on the tongues of those who survived. For though the Greeks had conquered the city of their enemies, they had awakened forces older and more patient than mortal anger. The gods, witnessing sacrilege and cruelty committed in the final hours of the siege, turned their eyes away from the Greeks. One by one, they withdrew their favor, leaving the returning heroes to navigate a world where divine protection had thinned like mist before the morning sun. Among those who set sail from the smoking ruins was Odysseus, the mind behind the wooden horse. His intellect had saved the Greeks, but it had also offended Poseidon, whose beloved son Polyphemus, the Cyclops, would later encounter him on his long journey. Odysseus did not yet know this. He believed he was sailing home to Ithaca, to Penelope, whose patience had already become mythic in its endurance, and to his young son Telemachus, barely a child when he left. But the sea is not kind to men who believe they have mastered fate. The voyage stretched on, bending time into something unrecognizable. Days turned into years, years into stories whispered by sailors across the Mediterranean. Odysseus's name became synonymous with wandering, for the sea seemed determined to test every part of him, his courage, his wit, his morality, his loyalty. The winds, once allies to Greek ships, became unpredictable, driven by the god whose wrath had been stirred. The encounter with the Lotus Eaters nearly cost Odysseus his crew, as the intoxicating fruit threatened to steal their memories and erase their desire to return home. The colossal Cyclops cave nearly became their tomb. The winds gifted by Aeolus nearly carried them back to Ithaca, until the crew, suspicious and curious, opened the forbidden bag and unleashed a tempest that sent them hurtling off course. On the island of Circe, enchantment lurked behind beauty, turning men into swine until Odysseus, armed with Hermes' guidance, forced the sorceress to restore them. A year passed there, lost to pleasure and repose, but time means little to a man who has begun to forget whether home is a place or a dream. The underworld awaited him next, a realm of shadows and truths that could not be escaped. There Odysseus met the ghost of Achilles, who confessed that he would rather be a living servant than a dead hero. The admission pierced Odysseus' heart, for he saw in it a reflection of his own growing weariness. He also met the prophet Tiresias, who warned him that Poseidon's anger would not fade easily, and that his journey was far from over. Sirens with voices like woven silk beckoned him toward death. Scylla and Charybdis lurked like embodiments of impossible choices, one demanding sacrifice, the other threatening complete annihilation. His crew slaughtered the sacred cattle of Helios, inviting divine wrath. The sea answered by swallowing his ship. In the end, Odysseus drifted alone, clinging to debris as if clinging to the last fragment of hope. He washed ashore on the island of Calypso, where the goddess offered him eternal youth and immortality in exchange for companionship. Many men would have accepted without hesitation, but Odysseus longed not for eternal life, but for mortal completion, for Penelope, for Ithaca, for the familiar smell of olive trees in the morning sun. The gods eventually intervened, forcing Calypso to release him. Even when Odysseus finally reached Ithaca after 10 long years, he found no peace. His palace was overrun by suitors vying for Penelope's hand, squandering his wealth, mocking his name, threatening his legacy. With the help of Telemachus and a few loyal servants, he reclaimed his home in a burst of violent justice. But the cost weighed heavily on him, for although he had returned, the man who stepped onto the shores of Ithaca was not the same man who had left. War had carved him, loss had hollowed him. The sea had reshaped him into something both more and less than he once was. While Odysseus battled fate at sea, other Greek heroes met darker destinies at home. Agamemnon, commander of the Greek forces, returned to Mycenae expecting triumph. Instead, he walked into the embrace of betrayal. Clytemnestra, his queen, had not forgiven him for sacrificing their daughter Iphigenia. She had taken Aegisthus as a lover, and on the night of Agamemnon's return, as he entered his bath, she wrapped him in cloth, rendering him unable to defend himself, and struck him down. For a moment the palace echoed with the sound of justice twisted into vengeance. Their son Orestes later avenged his father by killing Clytemnestra, an act that unleashed the Furies upon him, driving him mad until the gods themselves were forced to intervene. His torment symbolized the end of an era in which violence could repay violence endlessly. Justice, once a simple matter of blood, was now evolving into something more complex. Law, deliberation, morality. Greece was changing. But perhaps the most enduring tale born from Troy's ashes was not Greek at all. It belonged to a Trojan prince who escaped the burning city with destiny burning behind his eyes. Aeneas, guided by the gods, and burdened with the memory of a civilization extinguished, wandered across the seas much like Odysseus, yet with a different purpose. Where Odysseus sought home, Aeneas sought a future. He carried his father on his back, his son by the hand, and the ashes of Troy in his heart. His wanderings took him to Carthage, where Queen Dido fell deeply in love with him. For a time, Aeneas tasted peace, the kind that a man fleeing destruction rarely knows. But the gods reminded him that his destiny lay elsewhere, westward, across the sea, toward the land that would one day become Rome. When he departed, Dido, devastated, lit a pyre and cursed his bloodline. That curse, whispered across generations, would one day ignite the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage, proof that the consequences of Troy's fall reached far beyond its walls. Aeneas eventually reached the shores of Italy, where his descendants would become kings, then conquerors, then emperors. The fall of Troy birthed the rise of Rome, a new world growing from the ashes of the old. Across the Greek world, the consequences of Troy rippled outward. The heroes, once blessed by the gods, now struggled with the fragility of mortality. Ajax fell into madness and took his own life. Diomedes returned home only to find betrayal. Menelaus and Helen wandered long before finally reclaiming Sparta. Nestor alone returned to peace, his wisdom having shielded him from the worst burdens of fate. But the greatest transformation was not in the lives of men. It was in the relationship between mortals and the gods. The age in which deities walked freely among humans, influencing wars and marriages, punishing pride and rewarding devotion, began to fade. The gods themselves seemed to withdraw from the world, their temples standing tall but their voices becoming distant. Perhaps they had grown weary of the endless bloodshed. Perhaps the rise of new cultures weakened their influence. Or perhaps this fading was the natural course of time. For no age lasts forever, not even one shaped by immortals. In the centuries that followed, the stories of Troy, of Achilles and Hector, of Odysseus and Aeneas transformed. What had once been living memory became poetry. Poets crafted epics, philosophers used the stories to teach. Playwrights turned the tragedies into warnings for future generations. The world moved forward, but it carried these stories like seeds in the wind, letting them take root in new lands, new languages, new minds. The gods, though less present, remained symbols of nature, emotion, and human aspiration. Zeus thundered not in the sky but in literature. Athena guided not warriors but thinkers. Aphrodite inspired not divine unions but mortal love. Apollo's lyre became the harmony of music and reason. The Trojan War had ended, but the age it defined stretched far beyond the ruined city's stones. It influenced the founding myths of nations, shaped the ethics of societies, and echoed through art for millennia. Even as temples crumbled and empires rose and fell, the memory of that war, its heroes, its betrayals, its suffering, its fragile humanity, endured. Long after the last embers of Troy cooled, the plain remained strangely quiet. Shepherds grazed their flocks where Achilles once raged. Farmers tilled soil enriched by ash and blood. Travelers passed through without knowing the weight of history beneath their feet. But sometimes, on certain nights when the moon hung pale in the sky, the wind seemed to whisper names: Hector, Andromache, Priam, Paris, Achilles, echoes of an age when gods and men shared the same stage. This silence, however, was not emptiness. It was the silence that follows the closing of a great book, the silence that invites reflection, remembrance, and reverence. For the people who came after understood that the story of Troy was not merely about war. It was about the human soul, its longing for glory, its capacity for love, its vulnerability to pride, its hunger for meaning, and its struggle against fate. In the end, the Trojan War was less a conflict between nations than a mirror held up to humanity, a mirror that reflected both the brightest and darkest parts of our nature. And though the gods withdrew, the stories remained. They traveled farther than armies, lived longer than empires, and became part of the shared heritage of the world. For myths never truly end. They change, they fade, they reappear in new forms. They evolve with the people who remember them. And in remembering, we keep alive not just the stories, but the lessons hidden within them. The heroic age had passed, but its legacy endured, etched into the foundations of Western imagination, carried in the breath of poets, preserved in the ink of historians, and whispered in the dreams of generations who never walked the shores of Troy yet felt its presence in their hearts. One age had ended. The ashes of Troy did not cool before a new world began to take shape. Across the Aegean Sea, the Greek mainland stirred with a restless energy, as though the fall of the great city had cracked open the shell of the old age and allowed something new to emerge. A world no longer defined by gods walking among men, but by men learning to walk on their own. The heroic age, with its bright flare of divine intervention and epic conflict, dimmed slowly like an ember in a dying fire. In its place rose the foundations of what Europe would one day call the classical world, a civilization built not on mythic feats but on thought, discipline, order, and the fragile yet resilient ambitions of ordinary mortals. The first generations after Troy inherited a land both wounded and ripe with possibility. Kingdoms had collapsed, dynasties had fallen, and the old palatial systems that once dominated Greece, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, were gone, swallowed by time and fire. Their stones lay scattered across hillsides, their treasures buried beneath rubble and earth. But in these ruins, new settlements took root. They began as small communities clustered around fertile valleys or atop rocky elevations, each governed not by absolute monarchs, but by councils of men who valued deliberation as much as strength. Slowly, these communities grew into polis, city-states, each with its own character, its own customs, its own sense of destiny. Among them, two cities emerged like twin pillars holding up the future of Greece. Sparta, forged in discipline and steel, and Athens, carved from wisdom and imagination. Sparta, nestled in the valley of the Uranus River, evolved into something both admired and feared. Its people believed that the chaos of the world demanded order, and they built that order through the most rigorous system of training and governance the ancient world had ever seen. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families to be forged into warriors, hard, obedient, unwavering. Their lives were disciplines in endurance, sleeping on reeds, eating sparse meals, learning to steal without being caught, fighting not for personal glory but for the survival of the state. Spartan women, unusual for the time, were granted a strength of their own. They trained in athletics, managed estates, and raised children to be fearless. They spoke openly, acted boldly, and understood that their freedom was tied directly to the power of their city. Sparta valued simplicity, austerity, and absolute loyalty. It sought to preserve the past through the purity of its traditions, resisting change as fiercely as it resisted invaders. Athens, by contrast, moved in the opposite direction, toward the unknown, the experimental, the transformative. Built upon the rocky peninsula of Attica, surrounded by the restless sea, Athens embraced the complexity of life. It allowed its citizens to question, to debate, to dream, to create. Its port at Piraeus grew swollen with trade, drawing influence from Egypt, Phoenicia, and the islands of the Aegean. Its marketplace, the Agora, became a melting pot of merchants, artisans, philosophers, politicians, and wanderers. Where Sparta raised warriors, Athens raised citizens. The people gathered in assemblies to vote on laws, argue policies, and shape their own future. Though imperfect, often chaotic, and limited to men of certain status, this system laid the foundation for what future ages would call democracy. And in the cracks of this political experiment grew something even more extraordinary: the birth of rational thought. Myth had not disappeared. The gods still adorned temples and festivals. Homeric poetry was still sung by traveling bards. But a subtle shift had begun. The Greeks started asking not only what did the gods do, but why does the world work this way? It was as though the fall of Troy had opened a door in the human mind, inviting mortals to seek answers within themselves rather than in divine mysteries. In the bustling heart of Athens, thinkers slowly emerged like sparks catching dry wood. They questioned the nature of reality, the shape of the cosmos, the substance of the soul. They sought patterns in the world instead of omens, causes instead of curses, reason instead of myth. The first philosophers wandered the streets barefoot, speaking to whoever would listen. Thales of Miletus looked at the sea not as Poseidon's realm, but as a key to understanding existence itself. Anaximander imagined atoms before atoms existed. Pythagoras saw harmony reflected in mathematics and believed numbers carried secrets older than any god. Meanwhile, poets turned inward, exploring human emotion rather than divine command. Hesiod wrote of the struggles of farmers, the bitterness of labor, the hunger for justice. Lyric poets such as Sappho captured the tremors of love and longing with words that echoed across centuries. Yet myth and philosophy did not battle for dominance, they intertwined. Greek tragedy, born in the theaters of Athens, wove together old stories with new questions. Playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides retold the legends of Troy and Thebes not to glorify the past, but to examine the human soul. Through the voices of their characters, they asked, what does honor cost? What is justice? Can fate be escaped? Can humans be free? Audiences wept as they watched the misfortunes of kings and heroes unfold upon the stage. They recognized in Oedipus, in Agamemnon, in Medea, in Ajax, reflections of themselves. It was as though the Greeks had taken the raw material of myth and carved from it a mirror. While Athens blossomed in thought, Sparta solidified in power. The two cities, so different in spirit, became the twin poles of Greek identity. one representing freedom, creativity, and argument, the other representing discipline, stability, and silence. Together, they shaped the cultural landscape that would one day influence Rome, the Renaissance, and modern Europe. Yet the Greek world was not defined by cities alone. A gathering point existed that transcended politics and geography. Olympia, where athletes competed not for wealth but for honor, watched by crowds from every corner of the Greek world. The Olympic Games created unity where otherwise only rivalry existed, and towering above every victory, every game, every temple, was Zeus, the old king of the gods, still honored, still powerful, yet becoming increasingly symbolic rather than literal. The gods had become ideals, their presence shifting from the physical to the philosophical. As the classical age evolved, Greece reached heights that no one in the aftermath of Troy could have imagined. Sculptors like Phidias shaped marble and bronze into forms that seemed alive. The curve of muscles, the softness of hair, the nobility of a face, all captured with a precision that echoed divine craftsmanship. Architects built temples that blended strength and beauty with mathematical perfection. The Parthenon, rising on the Acropolis, gleamed like a promise of immortality carved in stone. But even amidst this brilliance, shadows formed. The rivalry between Athens and Sparta, once manageable, began to swell with a tension that only two powerful cities can generate. Trade routes, alliances, pride, political differences, each became a spark added to a growing fire. The Persian invasions briefly united Greece, with heroes such as Leonidas of Sparta and Themistocles of Athens carving their names into history. But once the foreign threat disappeared, the old rivalries returned sharper than ever. The Peloponnesian War erupted like a storm that had long been gathering. Athens and Sparta clashed not only with spears and shields, but with ideals themselves. Democracy fought oligarchy. Innovation fought tradition. Navy fought infantry. The war dragged on for decades, leaving Greece weakened, fragmented, and vulnerable to future conquest. Even the gods, once invoked in every battle, felt absent from the chaos. As the centuries turned, a young king from the rugged land of Macedon rose to prominence, Alexander, son of Philip II. He admired Achilles, slept with a copy of the Iliad beneath his pillow, and dreamed of uniting Greece as one people. With brilliance, ruthlessness, and a charisma that inspired both fear and devotion, Alexander conquered city after city, forging a Greek alliance that marched eastward like a tidal wave. When he destroyed the Persian Empire and reached the edges of India, he carried Greek culture with him, its philosophy, its language, its art, its myths. He named cities after himself, spread Hellenic ideals across continents, and sought to become a bridge between worlds. Yet he too was mortal, and his death at the age of 32 fractured his empire into pieces. Still, the seeds he scattered took root. The Hellenistic age that followed brought an explosion of learning and diversity. Greek became the language of trade and diplomacy from Egypt to Syria to Afghanistan. Philosophical schools flourished: Stoicism, Epicureanism, Cynicism. Mathematics advanced under Euclid. Astronomy reached new heights with Aristarchus and Eratosthenes. Medicine evolved through the teachings of Hippocrates and later Galen. And the myths, once told around fires, now spread through libraries, scrolls, academies, and the newly expanding medium of written literature. Yet with each generation, the gods felt increasingly distant. They still adorned temples, but fewer believed that Zeus hurled actual thunderbolts or that Athena walked the walls of Athens. Instead, the gods became symbols of human virtues and weaknesses, archetypes rather than overseers. The old myths, though preserved, no longer governed the world. They inspired it. By the time Rome rose to dominance, Greek culture had already shaped the Mediterranean. The Romans conquered Greek lands but became Greece's intellectual heirs. They studied the epics, copied the statues, embraced the philosophies, and built temples honoring Greek gods under Latin names. Zeus became Jupiter, Athena became Minerva, Ares became Mars, Aphrodite became Venus. The myths transformed once again, taking new forms while retaining their ancient heart. This blending of worlds ensured that the legacy of the heroic age would survive long after the temples fell and the languages evolved. Centuries later, during the Renaissance, Europeans rediscovered Greek art, philosophy, and mythology, using them to ignite a new wave of creativity. Painters depicted Achilles and Orpheus. Writers revived the tragedies. Philosophers quoted Plato and Aristotle. Poets returned to the stories of Troy. The modern Western identity, its literature, politics, ethics, and aesthetics, owes its shape to the cradle of ideas formed in Greece after the fall of Troy. And yet, despite all these transformations, something intimate remained. The myths continued to whisper the same truths. Achilles still embodied rage, Hector honor, Penelope loyalty. Odysseus still represented curiosity and perseverance, while Helen symbolized desire's dangerous allure. These characters lived not in temples but in minds, in classrooms, in libraries, in art, in the quiet reflections of anyone who has ever wrestled with destiny or love or loss. Greece, with all its brilliance and fractures, left behind a message carved not in stone but in story, that humanity is capable of greatness and destruction, creativity and folly, courage and tragedy, and that understanding ourselves requires understanding the tales we inherit. Thus, from the smoking ruins of Troy rose not just new cities and new philosophies, but an entire worldview. The heroic age became memory, memory became myth, myth became foundation, and the foundation became the cultural DNA of Europe. For even today, when we speak of courage, we invoke Achilles. When we speak of wisdom, Athena. When we speak of tragic fate, Oedipus. When we speak of journeys, Odysseus. When we speak of beautiful destruction, Helen. The old gods may have faded, but their stories live in us, and so the classical world dawned not as a rejection of the heroic age, but as its evolution, an era where humans began to understand their own power, their own potential, their own responsibility. The gods stepped back and mortals stepped forward. The torch passed quietly from Olympus to earth. The myths did not die, they transformed. And in their transformation, they shaped the very soul of the Western world. As the classical Greek world reached its height and then began its slow descent into the horizon of history, a new power emerged from the West, a city forged from discipline, ambition, and a hunger for destiny. Rome, which began as a cluster of huts on 7 hills beside the Tiber River, grew into a force that would swallow kingdoms, reshape borders, and carry with it the cultural flame lit centuries earlier by Greece. The Greeks had shaped the mind of the Western world, but Rome would shape its body. The Roman Republic, and later the Roman Empire, did not erase Greek culture. It absorbed it with a hunger that bordered on reverence. Senators studied Greek literature. Generals carried copies of Homer into battle. Wealthy families hired Greek tutors to raise their children. Roman sculptors copied Greek statues so faithfully that later centuries would often mistake Roman copies for Greek originals. To be educated in Rome meant to understand Greece. And at the heart of this cultural inheritance lay myth. The tales of Zeus and Hera, Apollo and Artemis, Achilles and Hector, Odysseus and Aeneas. Rome adopted these stories, rewrote them, reshaped them, and breathed into them a new life. Zeus became Jupiter, stern yet protective. Hera became Juno, the matron of marriage. Ares became Mars, transformed from reckless violence into disciplined military virtue. Aphrodite became Venus, but with a beauty softened by Roman sensibilities. Yet perhaps no Greek myth influenced Rome more profoundly than the tale of Aeneas. The Romans believed that their city was founded by the very survivors of Troy itself. They traced their lineage back to the prince who fled the burning city carrying his father on his back and leading his young son by the hand. The Roman poet Virgil immortalized this belief in the Aeneid, a poem that blended Greek tragedy with Roman destiny. Aeneas became a symbol of duty, discipline, and sacrifice, the very values upon which Rome built its empire. The Romans did not simply inherit Greek myth, they expanded it, organizing it into a structure that could be taught, analyzed, and preserved. Temples were built, rituals formalized, festivals established. Greek gods took their place in Roman public life, their stories woven into the politics, art, and everyday belief of the empire. Yet even as Rome embraced the gods of Olympus, a quiet transformation was beginning. New ideas flowed into the empire from distant lands, from Judea, Egypt, Persia. Philosophies competed with rituals. Mystery cults offered salvation beyond the material world. And in a small Roman province, a movement was taking shape that would eventually transform not only Rome, but the entire course of European history. Christianity spread slowly at first, whispered in private homes, practiced by communities that valued humility over power, compassion over conquest, martyrdom over military glory. Its message, that the divine was not confined to mountaintops or temples but present in every soul, struck a very different tone from the world of Zeus and Hera. And although Christianity initially clashed with Roman authority, persecuted by emperors who saw it as a threat to the traditional pantheon, the movement persisted. It survived fire, torture, and exile. It grew strong. Where empires grew weak. When Constantine declared Christianity legal and later emperors embraced it as the state religion, the very foundation of Western spirituality shifted. The old gods, once worshipped across the Mediterranean, began to fade from daily life. Their temples were abandoned, their priests retired, their festivals absorbed or transformed. But myth, unlike ritual, does not disappear so easily. The stories of Greece, though no longer objects of worship, remained embedded in art, literature, and memory. As the Roman Empire crumbled under the weight of invasions, economic collapse, and internal decay, Europe entered a new era, one of wandering tribes, fortified monasteries, and kingdoms struggling to define themselves. The myths of Greece slept through this age, lying dormant in dusty manuscripts guarded by monks who preserved ancient texts, even as the world outside fell into chaos. But sleep is not death. In the dim light of candlelit scriptoria, monks copied the works of Homer, Sophocles, Plato, and Aristotle with patient devotion. They preserved the poems, plays, histories, and philosophies that had defined Greece. Europe, though fractured, still carried within its monasteries the seeds of ancient knowledge. For centuries, these manuscripts remained hidden treasures, read by few, understood by fewer. The common people lived by stories of saints and miracles rather than heroes and gods. But the myths waited. They rested quietly, like embers beneath ash, until the winds of a new age stirred them back to life. That wind arrived in Italy during the 14th century. It began in the cities of Florence, Venice, and Rome. Places where merchants grew wealthy, where scholars gathered, where artists experimented, where human curiosity awakened from a long slumber. This revival, later called the Renaissance, was not merely a rebirth of learning. It was a rediscovery of identity, a recognition that the modern world could reach across time and shake hands with the ancient one. Scholars traveled across Europe searching for forgotten texts. They unearthed Greek manuscripts, translated them, studied them, debated them. The words of Plato and Aristotle once again shaped philosophy. The tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides influenced drama. The epics of Homer inspired poets who sought to imitate his grandeur. Artists like Botticelli painted scenes of Aphrodite's birth, Jupiter's thunderbolts, Apollo's lyre. Sculptors carved marble figures reminiscent of Myron and Polykleitos. Architects rediscovered symmetry and proportion, modeling their buildings after the Parthenon and other ancient temples. For the first time in centuries, the gods of Olympus stepped out of the shadows, not as beings of worship, but as symbols of beauty, passion, creativity, and human potential. They became metaphors for the human condition. Zeus was authority. Athena was wisdom. Hermes was wit. Aphrodite was love. Ares was conflict. These gods, stripped of their literal divinity, transitioned into psychological archetypes. They represented the many faces of humanity. This transformation allowed Greek myth to adapt to a world that no longer believed in thunderbolts cast from mountaintops. It allowed their stories to survive not as divine truth, but as cultural truth, a truth that explored what it meant to be human, fragile yet striving for greatness. As Europe moved through the Renaissance into the Enlightenment, the myths continued to evolve. Thinkers such as Voltaire and Rousseau examined them as early attempts at explaining the world. Scientists compared mythic cosmology with Newton's laws. Philosophers used the stories to illustrate moral lessons or societal critiques. The gods became characters in operas, muses for poets, subjects for painters, and still their themes resonated: pride leading to downfall, love leading to sacrifice, ambition leading to tragedy. During the 19th century, Romantic poets rediscovered the emotional storms of Greek myth. Byron, Shelley, Keats, they saw in the legends of Prometheus, Medea, Orpheus, and Achilles reflections of their own inner battles. Historians and archaeologists traveled to Greece, uncovering the ruins of Mycenae and Troy, revealing that behind the myths lay fragments of historical truth. The ancient stones spoke again, bringing the stories closer to reality. By the 20th century, Greek myths had become a universal language, a set of symbols that transcended borders and cultures. Psychoanalysts like Freud and Jung used them to explore the unconscious mind. Writers adapted them into novels, films, and plays. Schools taught them not as religion but as literature. Museums filled with artifacts from ancient Greece, connecting millions of people to a distant past that still felt strangely familiar. Today, in the 21st century, the influence of Greek myth remains woven into the fabric of Western identity. We speak of Achilles' heels, Herculean tasks, Pandora's box, Trojan horses. We navigate mazes of technology while remembering the labyrinth of Crete. We fall in love and recall the arrow of Eros. We dream of voyages and think of Odysseus. We search for meaning and remember the oracle of Delphi. We debate ethics and echo Aristotle. We design cities with columns inspired by Athens. We tell stories of heroes and villains shaped by the blueprint forged millennia ago on the shores of the Aegean. The gods may no longer command worship, but they command imagination. They no longer shape the fate of nations, but they shape the inner lives of individuals. They no longer walk the earth, but they walk through our literature, our art, our philosophies. In the end, Greek myth did not fade, it transformed. It traveled through Rome, filtered through Christianity, slept through the Middle Ages, awakened in the Renaissance, matured in the Enlightenment, and expanded in the modern era. It survived the collapse of empires, the burning of libraries, the shifting of religions, the evolution of languages. Why? Because the myths were never truly about gods. They were about us, about our hunger for glory, our fear of loss, our struggle against fate, our longing for love, our ability to endure suffering, our desire to understand a world larger than ourselves. In every age, humans return to these stories because they reflect the timeless truths of our own nature. The myths hold a mirror to the human soul, and though centuries pass, the reflection remains familiar. And so, the final transformation of Greek myth is not an ending. It is a beginning. A beginning that continues in every generation that reads Homer, in every artist who paints Athena, in every philosopher who quotes Socrates, in every traveler who stands on the ruins of Troy and feels the weight of memory in the wind. The gods may be silent now, but their stories still speak. They speak to the child learning courage, to the scholar seeking knowledge, to the lover yearning for connection, to the soldier confronting fear, to the wanderer searching for home. And as long as humans feel these things, the myths will live. The heroic age ended long ago, but the age of myth never will. When the old gods faded into memory, their temples collapsing into dust and their names softening into poetry, the world did not fall silent. Human beings, as restless as the winds that crossed the Mediterranean, began shaping a new age, an age of empires, philosophies, and revolutions of spirit. The stories of Zeus, Athena, Poseidon, and Apollo did not disappear. They retreated into the undercurrent of culture, like ancient roots feeding a new and rising tree. Europe, which would one day become a continent shaped by kings, parliaments, cathedrals, and the engines of industry, still carried echoes of Olympus with it, even when it no longer believed in thunderbolts or nymphs. The disappearance of the Olympians was not a single event, nor a sudden collapse. It was a slow dimming, a long twilight during which old beliefs blended with new ideas, and the divine retreated from the world of visibility into the world of symbolism. For centuries after Theodosius closed the pagan temples, people still told stories of the gods, not as objects of worship, but as cultural memories shaped by time and retelling. Children grew up hearing of Heracles' impossible strength, not around sacred fires, but in the corners of wine shops, market stalls, and scholarly gatherings. The myths that once explained earthquakes and storms became metaphors for human weakness, ambition, and desire. As Europe changed, the myths changed with it, adapting not to survive in religion but in imagination. The Middle Ages wrapped Europe in a thick cloak of faith and hierarchy. Christianity spread through cathedrals, monasteries, and rural parishes, and the old gods became shadows lingering behind stone walls. But their disappearance was never total. Medieval scholars, copying ancient manuscripts, preserved Homer's tales even as they condemned their theology. Monks in candlelit scriptoria wrote commentaries that criticized Zeus's lust or Apollo's cruelty, yet they saved the stories nonetheless. Something in those ancient voices still compelled the European mind. They were too human to be erased, too powerful to be forgotten entirely. A monk might spend the morning writing biblical commentary and the evening quietly admiring the tragic dignity of Hector or the cunning bravery of Odysseus. The church banned pagan rituals, but it could not ban curiosity. In villages and countryside, fragments of ancient belief merged with Christian custom. Springs once sacred to nymphs became sites for saints' miracles. Forest clearings where Artemis was honored transformed into chapels, without ever fully losing their air of mystery. The people may not have known the names of the beings that once inhabited those landscapes, but they felt something ancient there, as though the land itself remembered its old gods. Europe, for all its newfound faith, continued to walk on soil shaped by the footsteps of myth. Then came the Renaissance, and with it a rebirth more profound than any revival of artistic technique. It was as if Europe exhaled after centuries of silence and rediscovered its old voice. Scholars in Florence, Venice, and Rome dusted off manuscripts forgotten in monastery libraries. They translated Homer and Hesiod into new languages and read them not with fear but with admiration. The gods returned, not as divine rulers, but as symbols of the human condition. Painters carved Athena into marble again, not as a deity, but as the embodiment of wisdom. Botticelli let Aphrodite rise from the sea once more, luminous on her shell, not as a goddess to pray to, but as a celebration of beauty and love. The Renaissance transformed the Olympians from rulers of nature into icons of culture, and in doing so, it ensured their immortality would take a new form. Europe's philosophers, poets, and thinkers began to consider the myths not as lies of the past, but as truths of a different kind, psychological, moral, emotional truths. The gods became mirrors of human behavior. Artemis represented independence, Apollo reason, Dionysus passion, Ares aggression, Athena strategy. They were the dramatic characters of the human soul, each representing something that never disappears from human nature. In the Renaissance view, Olympus was not a mountain, but a reflection of the human mind. Over the next centuries, Europe continued to reinterpret and reshape these stories. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and skepticism, did not reject the myths. It dissected them. Thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot approached the stories analytically, treating Zeus's thunderbolts as allegories rather than literal weapons. They believed the Olympians represented how early civilizations understood the universe, through imagination, storytelling, and symbolism. To them, Greek mythology was evidence of humanity's creativity, not its ignorance. The gods became examples of how the human mind evolves, first through myth, then through philosophy, then through science. This transformation marked an important shift in European culture. Myths were no longer explanations for how the world worked. They were explorations of why humans behave the way they do. Oedipus was no longer a cautionary tale about divine prophecy. He became a study in the danger of self-ignorance. Prometheus was not a titan punished by Zeus. He became a symbol of human ambition and suffering, inspiring poets, playwrights, and revolutionaries. Even Pandora, once blamed for unleashing suffering, became a metaphor for curiosity, temptation, and the complexity of human choice. And then came Romanticism, a movement that breathed new life into the ancient Greek imagination. The Romantics rejected the cold rationality of the Enlightenment and instead embraced emotion, tragedy, nature, and the sublime. Figures like Byron, Shelley, and Keats found in Greek myths a landscape rich with passion and melancholy. They admired the courage of heroes who fought against fate, the graceful sorrow of figures like Orpheus and Eurydice, the eternal yearning of the gods for love and beauty. The Romantic era returned the ancient myths to their emotional origins. Greece became not just a historical subject, but a spiritual homeland of the human heart. Poets traveled to ruins in Athens and Delphi, writing odes to broken pillars, imagining the voices of the gods lingering among the stones. They described the myths as if they were memories of a lost golden age, where human beings lived in direct conversation with divinity. For the Romantics, the ruins of Greece symbolized both beauty and loss. Beauty in what once existed, and loss in the knowledge that nothing divine remains forever. Europe's fascination with Greek myths deepened again in the 19th and early 20th centuries, this time through archaeology. When Schliemann claimed to discover the ruins of Troy, the boundary between myth and history blurred. Excavations at Mycenae, Knossos, and Delphi showed that beneath the stories lay real civilizations, real palaces, real kings, and real wars. Myth and reality intertwined, and Europe's imagination ignited once more. Suddenly Achilles felt like a figure who might have walked the earth, and Agamemnon, a king whose footsteps archaeologists could almost trace in the dust. The discovery of linear B tablets, frescoes, and ancient armor turned myth into archaeology and archaeology into myth again. Yet the greatest transformation came not from ruins or poetry, but from psychology. In the 20th century, thinkers like Jung and Freud turned to Greek mythology to explain the inner workings of the human mind. The Oedipus story became a framework for understanding desire and identity. Archetypes like the hero, the trickster, the mother, and the shadow were drawn from figures like Heracles, Hermes, Hera, and Hades. The myths became universal patterns of human experience, recognized by people of every culture. Europe no longer saw the gods as relics of ancient belief. It saw them as timeless symbols of human nature. In the modern world, where technology dominates and science explains what ancient people once attributed to divine intervention, the Greek gods remain remarkably alive. They appear in literature, cinema, video games, graphic novels, and even advertising. They shape superhero stories, fantasy epics, and philosophical essays. Writers bring them into contemporary cities. Filmmakers let them stride across digital landscapes. Musicians reference them in lyrics. The myths survive not because people believe them literally, but because they contain something emotionally authentic, something eternal. Every generation reinvents Greek mythology to express its own struggles about identity, power, love, destiny, fear, and ambition. And beneath all these modern interpretations lies a deeper truth. Humanity has never stopped needing stories. Ancient Greece understood this better than most. The myths did not only explain thunder or waves, they explained the world within, the storms of the heart, the tides of desire, the winds of fate. They gave shape to things that human beings could feel but could not easily articulate. Europe, in turn, inherited this powerful storytelling tradition, blending it with its own history, languages, religions, and philosophies. Today, when someone in London or Paris or Berlin references a Herculean task, they unknowingly echo a tale thousands of years old. When a novelist describes a character's Achilles heel, they draw directly from the language of myth. When people speak of opening a Pandora's box, they use a metaphor that began long before modern Europe even existed. These phrases endure because they express something universal. Greek mythology has woven itself into the very language of Europe. Even the structure of Western storytelling, heroes with flaws, journeys filled with trials, tragic downfalls, conflicts between fate and free will, comes from Greek myth. Modern stories, whether found in films or books, still follow patterns shaped by Homer, Hesiod, and the tragedians. The Greeks taught Europe that heroes are not perfect, gods are not always just, and fate is not always kind. They taught that wisdom comes from suffering, that love is powerful enough to move mountains, and that pride can destroy even the greatest of kings. In many ways, the modern world has returned to the philosophical questions that shaped Greek myth. Europeans today ask the same questions their ancestors did. Why do we suffer? What makes a person heroic? Do we control our fate, or does fate control us? What lies beyond death? What is the meaning of beauty, love, justice, honor? The answers have changed, but the questions remain the same. The myths continue to offer emotional truth even when stripped of divine power. They remind Europeans that their civilization, its literature, its art, its politics, its moral debates, stands on the foundations laid by ancient storytellers. And beneath all of this, something profound remains. The gods never truly left. They changed form. They moved into metaphor, into psychology, into art, into memory. They became part of the collective imagination of Europe. No longer beings to worship, they have become voices within the cultural mind, echoes that shape emotion, storytelling, and identity. The Olympians may no longer thunder across the sky or rise from the sea, but their presence still lingers in the European imagination, like footprints in ancient marble. They inhabit museums, libraries, and theaters. They speak in poetry and film. They breathe through language and symbolism. They live wherever stories are told. And in a way, that is a deeper immortality than even the gods themselves could have imagined. When all the tales have been told and the voices of gods and heroes finally sink beneath the quiet horizon of memory, we find ourselves standing in the long shadow of ages that no longer exist, yet refuse to be forgotten. The world the Greeks imagined, where storms were hurled by divine hands, where mountains opened to swallow queens, where destiny walked beside kings and whispered into their dreams, is not our world anymore. And yet it clings to us with a kind of gentle insistence, as though asking to be remembered. For thousands of years, these stories wandered from one generation to the next, carried not only by poets and scribes, but by ordinary people who found pieces of themselves in the sorrow of Demeter, in the courage of Perseus, in the torment of Orestes, in the longing of Odysseus for a home that seemed forever out of reach. And as Europe changed, its borders redrawn by war, its beliefs reshaped by new gods, its languages evolving like living branches from ancient roots, the myths did not vanish. Instead, they settled into the folds of the continent's collective soul, quietly guiding the imagination of artists who carve marble into gods long dead, inspiring scholars who trace the footsteps of heroes across the ruins of forgotten kingdoms, energizing thinkers who recognized, beneath the supernatural and the divine, something raw and profoundly human. For even as time erased the temples where incense once burned, even as the great philosophers replaced divine thunder with reason and law, the stories remained, lodging themselves in the cultural memory like seeds waiting for spring. They survived the fall of Athens and the rise of Rome, the darkness of the Middle Ages and the light of the Renaissance, slipping through the cracks of history with a resilience that kingdoms and empires could never imitate. And as we look back now across the vast distance between our world and theirs, we see that the myths were never truly about gods at all. They were about us. About our fear of the unknown, our hunger for glory, our endless struggle to understand suffering, joy, ambition, betrayal, and forgiveness. They showed us the heights a human being might reach and the depths to which a human heart might fall. They taught us that destiny is often a mirror we carry unknowingly, that love can bring both salvation and ruin, that courage means stepping into darkness even when the path is unclear, and that mortality, though feared by mortals and envied by gods, gives weight to every choice we make. And now, having walked through the storm-tossed seas of Odysseus and the burning walls of Troy, Having watched the rise of Zeus and the fall of empires, having witnessed the sorrow of Persephone and the fury of Achilles, we arrive at the quiet end of a long journey. The stories have unfolded, layer upon layer, each one revealing not only the shape of ancient belief, but the shape of the human heart itself. And as the echoes settle, as the great voices grow still, a single truth becomes clear. Myths endure because they speak to something timeless. They survive because, beneath the surface of divine thunder and supernatural trials, they contain emotions we still recognize: grief, pride, jealousy, longing, hope. They remind us that the world has always been fragile, that people have always feared the future, that love has always been complicated, that fate has always been uncertain. They remind us that even in a world ruled by gods, the smallest human decision can change everything. For Europe, these stories became more than relics of a distant past. They became the foundation of literature, the backbone of art, the blueprint of dramatic tragedy and epic honor. From the marble halls of Florence to the quiet libraries of Oxford, from the theaters of London to the academies of Paris, these myths shaped the Western imagination with a force no empire could rival. They taught painters to look for the divine in the human silhouette. They taught poets to seek meaning in metaphor. They taught philosophers to ask not only what the world is, but why it is as it is. And they taught ordinary people to search for themselves in ancient characters whose struggles, though wrapped in divine spectacle, were painfully recognizable. Now, as the final words of this long narrative pass like wind over quiet waters, you stand at the threshold between past and present, between what has been told and what remains to be remembered. And in this moment, the role once held by the poets, the bards, and the storytellers falls gently into your hands. For stories survive only when someone carries them onward. Myths remain alive only when a listener becomes a keeper, when a voice becomes a bridge between centuries. If you felt the weight of Achilles' anger, or the sorrow of Hecuba, or the fragile hope of Orpheus, then you have already become part of the ancient tradition. Those who hear, and in hearing, keep alive the fire of memory. And if this journey offered you something worth holding, a moment of wonder, a new understanding, a sense of connection to a world long gone, then allow the story to continue its path beyond this final breath. Share it with someone who loves history, or someone who does not yet realize that they do. Leave your thoughts as others once left offerings at the foot of forgotten temples. Your words may guide another traveler toward the myths that shaped human civilization. And if you wish this series of journeys to continue, to move deeper into the ancient world or into the distant myths of other cultures, then lend your support. A gesture as small as a like, a comment, a share, or a subscription may seem insignificant, but it is through such gestures that stories find new life, rising again not through divine command, but through human choice, just as they have for thousands of years. For as the last echoes of Olympus dim, and the long night stretches across the forgotten lands of heroes and kings, the myths do not die. They simply wait. They wait in books and in ruins, in the quiet memory of old cities, in the silent dust of ancient marble. They wait in the minds of those who still believe that the past has something to teach, something to warn, something to give. And as long as there are people who listen, who wonder, who imagine, the gods will never truly fade and the heroes will never forget the sound of their own names. So as we leave this world behind, I thank you for walking beside us through the shadows of history and the fires of legend. Wherever you are, wherever you go after this moment, carry these stories with you, for they are part of the great inheritance of humanity. And if you wish them to return again in another tale, another journey, another exploration of ancient worlds, then let your voice be heard. Good night.